Hello everyone, I am the Boring Historian and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Ragnar Haraldsson stood at the edge of his field, the cool autumn air filling his lungs as he surveyed what remained of the season's harvest. The barley had been good this year, not the best he'd seen in his 42 winters, but far from the worst. Behind him, his sons Erik and Bjorn loaded the last sheaves onto a cart while his daughter Sigrid gathered fallen grains, ensuring nothing went to waste. Every kernel would matter in the months to come. "We'll finish before nightfall," Erik called out, wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill. "The ale for winter will be plentiful." Ragnar nodded, but kept his eyes on the northern horizon, where dark clouds were gathering. His bones felt the change coming, as they always did. 2 ravens circled overhead, Odin's messengers, perhaps, bringing warnings of the harsh season ahead. The Jarl had predicted a difficult winter during the last assembly. The elder women of the village, who knew the signs better than most men, agreed. "The mice have thick fur already." His wife Astrid had told him 3 nights ago as they lay in bed, her voice a whisper so as not to worry the children. "And the bears came down from the high country earlier than usual. We must prepare more thoroughly this year." In the small coastal village of Skoravik, nestled in a protected fjord on Norway's western coast, preparations for winter were not merely a chore, but a complex orchestration of community effort that began long before the first frost. By the time the leaves turned golden and red, the rhythm of life had already shifted toward the single-minded purpose of survival. The village's 6 longhouses housed 37 souls this year, plus the thralls, not counting old Ivar, who had passed during the summer raids, or the 3 newborn children who had yet to survive their first winter. Whether they would all see the spring thaw depended on how well they heeded the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors now. "Father," Bjorn called, breaking Ragnar's contemplation. "Leif says there are still berries on the north slopes. Should we gather them tomorrow?" Ragnar turned to his younger son, a boy of 12 winters but already showing the broad shoulders of his grandfather. "Yes, but take your sister and 2 others. The bears will be hungry and desperate before they den." Across Scandinavia, this scene repeated itself in hundreds of settlements, from small farmsteads to the larger trading centers. In Denmark, where the winters were milder but still demanding, the preparations might be less frantic. In the far northern reaches of Norway or the inland regions of Sweden, where winter's grip could hold for 8 months or more, the work was more urgent, the margin for error non-existent. In Iceland, where Norse settlers had established themselves over the past century, the isolation added another layer of danger. No neighboring villages could offer surplus if stores ran short. In Greenland, the newest and most precarious of Norse settlements, each winter was a gamble with death. But regardless of location, the pattern was the same. Summer and early autumn were times of frenzied activity, fishing, hunting, harvesting, and preserving. By mid-autumn, the focus shifted to final preparations, securing structures against winter storms, bringing livestock into closer quarters, completing essential tools and equipment, and setting aside fuel for the long dark. For Ragnar and his family, like all Vikings, survival through winter required planning that bordered on obsession. Their calendar divided the year not into 4 seasons, but 2. Summer, the time of light and growth, and winter, the time of darkness and endurance. As Ragnar walked back toward the last of the harvest, he mentally catalogued what remained to be done before the first heavy snow. The fishing nets needed mending. The north wall of the longhouse required additional reinforcement after last spring's storm damage. The smoke hole in the roof needed a new adjustable cover. The winter sledges had to be inspected and repaired. He glanced at the sky again. Perhaps 4 weeks before the deep cold set in. It would be enough time, but barely. "We'll need more peat for the fire," he said to no one in particular as he reached for his scythe. "And tell your mother we should smoke more of the fish tonight." Preparations weren't merely about gathering and storing food, though that was the foundation of winter survival. The Vikings understood that surviving winter required a holistic approach, one that addressed not only physical needs, but also the challenges of isolation, confinement, darkness, and cold. In the chieftain's hall at the center of the village, Jarl Halvard was conducting his own preparations. Political alliances had to be secured before travel became difficult. Disputes needed resolution before confinement in close quarters turned minor grievances into blood feuds. Tribute and taxes had to be collected and stored. "The old widow Gerda has no sons to chop wood," the Jarl's steward reported. And the Thorvaldsen family lost their stores when their roof collapsed last week. "Assign 2 men to rebuild Thorvaldsen's roof tomorrow," the Jarl replied, "and have the youngest thrall chop wood for the widow. She can pay with her weaving in spring." This, too, was preparation for winter, ensuring that the social fabric remained strong enough to withstand the stresses of the dark months. A community fractured by conflict or weakened by neglect of its vulnerable members was less likely to survive intact. As darkness fell, Ragnar's family returned to their longhouse. The central hearth already glowed with embers, tended by Astrid throughout the day. The warmth of the fire and the smell of brewing stew created an immediate sense of sanctuary from the increasing chill outside. Here, in this single room, where they would spend most of their waking and sleeping hours for the next half-year, the focus of preparation shifted from gathering to processing. Sigrid and her mother sat near the fire, sorting through the day's berry harvest, separating those to be eaten fresh from those to be dried or preserved with honey. In the corner, Eric and Bjorn repaired fishing hooks and line by the light of a fish oil lamp, while Ragnar inspected the winter clothing that would soon become their second skin. Outside, the wind picked up, bringing with it the first hint of snow on the air. Inside, the family worked in comfortable near silence, each focused on their task, but drawing strength from the presence of the others. The real test still lay ahead, but generations of Norse blood had prepared them for what was to come. They were Vikings, after all. Winter was not their enemy, but their teacher, their challenge, and in many ways the forge that had shaped them into who they were. The first hard frost came earlier than expected, on a clear night when the stars shone with painful brilliance. Freyja Thorsdottir woke before dawn to find delicate crystal patterns etching the inside of the shutters. The moisture from last night's breath transformed by cold into miniature landscapes of ice. At 45, Freyja had seen enough winters to read their early signs with the accuracy of a skald reciting familiar verse. This morning's frost, arriving before the last leaves had fallen, spoke of a winter eager to begin its reign, a bad omen for those who still had preparations to complete. She slipped from beneath the heavy furs of her sleeping platform, careful not to wake her husband Gunnar, who had returned late from hunting with the men. The packed earth floor felt like stone against her bare feet as she moved toward the central hearth, where only the faintest glow of embers remained. Kneeling, she fed small twigs and dried moss to the coals, blowing gently until flames appeared, then adding progressively larger pieces of wood. The fire was the heart of the household, its maintenance a sacred responsibility she rarely delegated even to her eldest daughter. In the dark months, fire was life itself. As the flames grew higher, their light revealed the interior of the longhouse, a single room approximately 60 feet long and 18 feet wide, its pitched roof supported by paired wooden posts that divided the space into a central hall with side aisles. Sleeping platforms lined the walls, currently occupied by her husband, their 4 children, Gunnar's elderly mother, and 2 thralls who had been with the family since before their youngest child was born. Smoke from the fire rose toward the roof, much of it escaping through the smoke hole above, though some lingered, creating a perpetual haze in the upper portion of the room. The smoky atmosphere served its purpose, however, helping to cure the meat and fish hanging from the rafters, while deterring insects and preventing rot in the roof timbers. Moving quietly, Freya added water to the large soapstone pot hanging over the fire. The vessel, traded at great expense from visitors from the far north, was one of her most prized possessions, far superior to clay pots for cooking over an open flame. Into the water went dried herbs, barley, and small pieces of preserved fish, a simple morning porridge that would fuel the day's work. By the time the rest of the household began to stir, dawn was breaking, revealing a world transformed. Every surface outside glistened with frost, and the puddles near the animal pen had frozen solid. Gunnar emerged from the sleeping platform, stretching his tall frame before moving to the door. "First ice," he said after surveying the scene outside. "The gods are warning us to hurry." Freya nodded. "The root cellar must be finished today." "It will be," Gunnar assured her, though his eyes betrayed concern. The root cellar, a pit dug into the ground and lined with stone, covered with layers of wood, earth, and eventually snow for insulation, was essential for storing vegetables through the winter. Theirs had partially collapsed during the spring floods, and rebuilding had been delayed by the demands of summer fishing and farming. As the household gathered around the fire for the morning meal, Freya assessed her family with the critical eye of one whose planning would determine their fate. Gunnar, still strong at 48, though his beard now showed more silver than red. Their sons Leif and Newt, 19 and 17, already accomplished hunters and fishermen. Their daughters Ingrid and Solveig, 15 and 12, skilled in the women's crafts that were equally essential to survival. Gunnar's mother Hilda, bent with age but sharp of mind, had survived 69 winters, a remarkable feat that gave her words great weight when she spoke of the signs she observed. And finally, the thralls, Oskar and Wenda, bound to the family by law, but integrated into its workings with a familiarity that blurred some of the distinction between free and unfree. "The mice have finished their nest in the south wall," Hilda announced between spoonfuls of porridge. "They've used more sheep's wool than I've ever seen. The winter will be brutal." No one questioned her assessment. Animal behavior had proven a more reliable predictor than human intuition many times before. "We should slaughter another goat," Freya suggested. "We won't be able to feed them all through a long winter, and the meat will be needed." Gunnar considered this, then nodded. "The old nanny, then. Her milking days are behind her." The morning's first frost initiated a subtle but significant shift in the household's activities. Projects that could wait gave way to those that couldn't. The luxury of pacing work evenly through the shortening days vanished, replaced by the urgency of beating winter's full arrival. Across the village, similar scenes played out as families reassessed their preparations in light of the frost's warning. The communal smoking shed worked at full capacity, preserving the last of the autumn hunt. Women gathered for collective wool working, their fingers flying as they processed the raw material into the yarn and fabric that would become essential winter clothing. "We'll need more skins for boots," Freya told Ingrid as they walked to join the woolworking circle. "See if you can trade some of your embroidery with Brynja Hallsdottir." Her husband returned from his journey with several good hides. For all the Norse people, from the Danes in the south to the far northern Swedes and Norwegians, the first frost marked a psychological as well as practical turning point. Summer's abundance was truly over. Winter's scarcity now governed all decisions. Waste became unthinkable, cooperation essential, and foresight the most valuable skill one could possess. In the chieftain's hall, the first frost brought a different kind of preparation. Jarl Halvard called his advisors together to assess the village's collective readiness. "How stand our stores?" he asked his steward. "The harvest was good, but not exceptional," came the reply. "If winter is as harsh as the signs suggest, we'll have enough to survive, but little excess." The Jarl nodded gravely. "And the widows, the elderly, those without family?" "We've assigned young men to ensure they have sufficient firewood. 3 families will need grain from the common store before spring." "See that they get it," the Jarl commanded. "No one starves while others have full bellies. That is not our way." This, too, was part of the Norse response to winter, a pragmatic communalism that recognized individual survival depended on collective strength. While each family was expected to prepare for their own needs, the community maintained a safety net for those who, through misfortune or lack of able-bodied workers, could not fully provide for themselves. The first frost also initiated ritual preparations. In the sacred grove outside the village, the local Gothi priest of the old gods made offerings to Thor for protection from the coming storms, to Odin for wisdom to make the right decisions during the difficult months ahead, and to Freyr and Freya for fertility to return with the spring. For children, the first frost brought excitement rather than anxiety. Despite the increased workload, there was anticipation of winter's unique pleasures. Skating on frozen lakes with bone skates tied to leather boots, sledding down hills on wooden boards, and most of all, the Yule celebrations that would break the monotony of the darkest days. But the adults knew that beneath the children's excitement lay the cold reality. The first frost was just the beginning of a battle they would fight with strategy, community, and endurance. They were entering the time when days would shrink to a few precious hours of weak sunlight, when temperatures would plunge so low that exposed skin could freeze in minutes, when illness could spread rapidly through confined populations, and when dwindling supplies would test both physical resources and social bonds. As the day progressed, the frost melted under the autumn sun, but its message remained. In the cold lands of the north, winter was not simply a season to be endured. It was an adversary to be respected, prepared for, and ultimately outsmarted through the accumulated wisdom of generations who had faced the same challenge and survived to pass on their knowledge. By nightfall, Freya's family had made significant progress. The root cellar was structurally complete, needing only its final covering. The old nanny goat had been slaughtered, its meat already in the smoking shed, its blood made into sausages, its hide scraped, and beginning the tanning process that would transform it into usable leather. Nothing was wasted, nothing could be. As darkness fell, the family gathered once more around the hearth, the center of their winter world. Tomorrow would bring new tasks, new urgency, but for now, in the firelight, with full bellies and the satisfaction of progress made, they allowed themselves a moment of contentment. Winter was coming, but they would be ready. The full moon of late autumn rose blood-red over the fjord, casting an eerie glow over the landscape already dusted with early snow. In the Norse calendar, this was the slaughter moon, blood mother, when livestock that could not be fed through winter met their end to sustain the human community. Halvor Eriksson, master of the largest farm in the area, stood in the moonlight surveying the animals in his pen. Behind him, his eldest son Anders prepared the killing area, a spot with good drainage, close enough to the smoking shed and preparation tables for efficiency, but far enough from the living quarters to contain the gore and smell. The ram first, Halvor decided, pointing to a massive wool-heavy animal. Then the older ewes. We'll keep the yearlings and the 2 best breeding rams. Anders nodded, knowing the calculations behind his father's choices were not made lightly. Each animal kept through winter required fodder that had been laboriously harvested and stored during the summer months. Each animal slaughtered meant meat, fat, blood, bones, and hide that would help the family survive until spring. The balance determined the difference between prosperity and starvation. Across Scandinavia, similar scenes unfolded as communities engaged in the critical task of culling their herds. The timing was deliberate, late enough in the season that the meat would not spoil in the increasingly cold temperatures, but early enough that the animals had not yet lost condition from reduced feeding. The slaughter moon was more than a practical necessity. It was a spiritual threshold, a time when the Norse people acknowledged the harsh bargain of northern survival. Life required death. Human survival came at the cost of animal sacrifice. This reality was reflected in their religious practices, where animal sacrifice to the gods shared the same linguistic root as the month of slaughter. As dawn broke, the work began in earnest. Halvor's entire extended family participated, each with assigned roles developed over years of practice. The men handled the killing and initial butchering. Women managed the complex task of processing every usable part, separating fat for rendering into tallow, cleaning intestines for sausage casings, collecting blood for black pudding, sorting organ meat for immediate consumption or preservation. Even the children had responsibilities, running messages between work areas, carrying tools, or assisting with simpler tasks appropriate to their age and skill. No one was exempt. No hands remained idle during this critical community effort. The blood must be stirred constantly. Ingrid Halvorsdottir instructed her niece, who had been assigned to prevent clotting in the large wooden bowl, catching the lifeblood of a freshly killed sheep. If it clots, it's useless for the pudding. The young girl nodded seriously, continuing to stir with rhythmic determination, understanding the importance of her task despite her youth. In Viking society, children were integrated into survival work early, learning through participation rather than formal instruction. By midday, the farmyard resembled a battlefield, with blood-stained snow and steam rising from freshly exposed carcasses. Yet despite the gore, there was order in the chaos, a practiced efficiency that transformed death into the means of life. Nothing went to waste. Meat was sorted according to its best use, some for immediate cooking, some for smoking, some for drying, some for fermenting. Fat was rendered into tallow for candles and waterproofing. Bones were set aside for tools, glue, and soup stock. Hides began the long process of transformation into leather. Blood became an ingredient in various foods. Even the less desirable offal found purpose as bait for winter fishing or trapping. This comprehensive use of resources was not unique to the Norse. Most pre-industrial societies practiced similar efficiency, but the Vikings elevated it to a defining cultural characteristic. Their environment allowed no margin for waste, and their ethics regarded squandering resources as not merely foolish but morally wrong. The slaughter was also a social occasion. Neighboring families often worked together, pooling labor and expertise to process many animals at once. Knowledge was shared, techniques compared, and the products sometimes distributed according to need as well as contribution. Your youngest has a cough, Astrid, an elderly neighbor, noted to a younger woman as they worked side by side cleaning intestines. Take some of the liver oil for him, and come by my house tomorrow. I have herbs that will help. This casual exchange illustrated another aspect of Viking winter preparation: the integration of medical knowledge into everyday practice. With no professional healers, medical wisdom was distributed throughout the community, particularly among older women whose experience made them repositories of practical healing knowledge. As the day progressed, the focus shifted from slaughter to preservation. Smokehouses worked at full capacity, their fires carefully maintained to produce the right combination of heat and smoke. Salt, a precious commodity often traded at significant expense, was measured out carefully for meat that would be preserved by brining. Some meat was hung to dry in the increasingly cold air, which would slow bacterial growth enough to prevent spoilage. Other portions were processed into pemmican-like preparations, with dried meat pounded and mixed with rendered fat and berries to create calorie-dense food that would remain edible for months. By evening, much of the initial work was complete, though the processing would continue for days. As darkness fell, the community gathered for a feast featuring the parts of the slaughtered animals that could not be preserved, a practical necessity transformed into celebration. To the animals who give their lives that we might live, Halvor toasted, raising a horn of ale, and to Freyr, Lord of Fertility, who blesses our herds. The gathering around the fire was more than a meal. It was a reaffirmation of community bonds before the isolating months ahead. Stories were told, news exchanged, marriages negotiated, disputes resolved. The shared work of the day strengthened the social fabric that would be tested by winter's confinement. For the Norse people, the slaughter moon marked a crucial psychological transition. With its passing, the community turned inward, both physically and mentally. The last major outdoor work was complete. Now began the time of indoor tasks, close quarters, and conservation of resources. The slaughter also forced confrontation with mortality, a reminder that survival required difficult choices, and that death was not a distant abstraction, but a present reality. This consciousness permeated Norse culture, from their practical approach to resource management to their spiritual beliefs about fate and the afterlife. As the feast concluded and families returned to their respective homes, Halvor made a final inspection of the day's work. Meat hung properly in the smokehouse, vats of brine held joints that would feed his family in the depths of winter, and a fresh layer of straw covered the blood-stained earth of the slaughter area. Tomorrow would bring more processing work, but the critical transition had been made. Death had been transformed into the means of life, and the community had taken another crucial step in its preparation for winter's challenge. The slaughter moon shone overhead, now silver rather than blood red, illuminating a landscape prepared to face the darkness ahead. Astrid Eriksdottir's fingers moved with practiced precision as she worked the spindle, drawing out woolen thread from the distaff held under her arm. At 62, her eyes might not be as sharp as they once were, but her hands remembered what they had done for over half a century. Around her, in the longhouse, 3 generations of women engaged in various stages of textile production, from carding raw wool to weaving fabric on the upright loom in the corner. "More twist," she instructed her granddaughter Ingrid, who was learning the critical skill of spinning. "Winter thread needs to be tight and strong. Lives depend on it." This was no exaggeration. In the cold lands of the Norse, Clothing was not merely covering, but survival equipment. A properly dressed Viking could work outdoors in temperatures that would kill the unprepared in hours. Their clothing technology, developed over centuries of adaptation to one of Earth's most challenging environments, was as sophisticated in its way as their shipbuilding or metallurgy. The foundation of Viking winter clothing was wool, the miracle fiber that kept its insulating properties even when wet. Unlike cotton or linen, which could be deadly in winter if they became damp, wool continued to provide warmth by creating pockets of heated air next to the skin even after exposure to snow or rain. The wool came primarily from the small, hardy sheep that had been bred over generations to survive northern conditions. These animals produced a dual-layer fleece, a soft, insulating undercoat, and longer, water-resistant outer hairs. Viking textile workers took advantage of both, sometimes separating them for different uses, and sometimes combining them for fabrics that offered both comfort and protection. The process of transforming raw wool into usable clothing was labor-intensive and continuous. Throughout the year, but especially during the confined winter months, women worked at every stage, sorting wool by quality and color, washing it to remove lanolin and dirt, carding it to align the fibers, spinning it into thread, dyeing it with plants or minerals, weaving it into fabric, and finally sewing it into garments. This winter, we'll need new tunics for the boys, Astrid's daughter Frida noted as she worked at the loom. They've outgrown everything from last year. Use the dark gray wool for the outer layers, Astrid advised. It sheds rain better than the lighter colors. The basic Viking winter wardrobe followed the principle of layering, a concept modern outdoor enthusiasts would recognize immediately. Rather than relying on a single heavy garment, Norse people wore multiple lighter layers that trapped warm air between them and could be adjusted according to activity level and conditions. For men, the foundation was a linen undertunic, linen being preferred next to the skin for its comfort, as wool could be itchy. Over this came a woolen tunic reaching to mid-thigh or knee, belted at the waist. Legs were covered with woven wool trousers, often reinforced with extra layers at the knees. For additional warmth, leg wrappings similar to puttees might be wound from ankle to knee. Women's base clothing consisted of a linen underdress covered by a woolen overdress suspended from shoulder straps fastened with decorative brooches. The arrangement allowed for layering while maintaining freedom of movement needed for work. Both men and women might add a woolen shawl or cloak for additional protection, often fastened with a pin or brooch to keep hands free. Footwear was critical for winter survival. Vikings typically wore leather shoes or ankle boots, sometimes lined with wool or fur for additional insulation. In deep snow, they might add a kind of snowshoe made from a wooden frame with leather lacings, allowing them to traverse drifts without sinking. Ragnhild, bring me the leather scraps, Astrid called to her youngest granddaughter. I'll show you how to make insoles for your winter boots. Your feet will thank me when the real cold comes. The girl brought over a collection of soft leather pieces, watching intently as her grandmother demonstrated how to cut and stitch them into insoles that would provide an additional barrier between feet and frozen ground. Always carry dry insoles when traveling in winter, Astrid advised. When the ones you're wearing get damp from sweat, replace them. Wet feet in winter mean death. This practical wisdom, passed from generation to generation, represented the accumulated experience of countless winters. Small details, the proper way to lace a boot to prevent snow entry, the correct overlap of a cloak to block wind, the ideal placement of seams to prevent chafing during movement, made the difference between comfort and injury, sometimes between life and death. Head covering was another essential component of Viking winter wear. Most common was the hood, either attached to the cloak or separate, which protected not only the head, but also the neck and shoulders from wind and precipitation. These hoods were often designed with a face opening that could be adjusted according to conditions, pulled forward in blowing snow or loosened in milder weather. For the hands, mittens provided better insulation than gloves by allowing fingers to share warmth, though gloves offered better dexterity for tasks requiring fine motor control. Both were typically made of wool, sometimes with leather palms for durability and grip. The most sophisticated designs featured a mitten with a slit that allowed the wearer to extend their fingers for detailed work without removing the entire mitten. Sven will need new mittens before he goes hunting next month, Frida noted, setting aside wool for the purpose. The leather on his old ones is worn through at the palms. As with all aspects of Viking material culture, winter clothing reflected a practical creativity that made the most of available resources. When wool or leather was scarce, they might incorporate alternative materials. Birch bark as an insulating layer in footwear, dried moss as padding, or fish skin as a waterproof outer layer. The waterproofing of outer garments was achieved through various methods. Wool naturally repels water to some degree due to lanolin, the natural oil in sheep's wool. This property could be enhanced by treating wool with additional fats or oils. Leather outer garments might be treated with a mixture of beeswax and animal fat to increase water resistance. Color in Viking clothing served both practical and social purposes. Natural wool colors, white, gray, brown, and black, were most common, but dyes were used to create blues, reds, greens, and yellows. Darker colors were often preferred for winter outer garments, not only because they showed dirt less, but also because they absorbed more solar radiation, providing additional warmth on sunny days. The quality and decoration of clothing also signaled social status. While all Norse clothing prioritized function, those of higher status might display their position through finer weaves, more complex patterns, or decorative elements like tablet-woven bands at hems and cuffs. The Jarl's wife has requested a new winter cloak, Astrid mentioned to Frida. She wants it lined with fox fur and edged with the tablet weaving you do so well. Frida nodded, recognizing both the honor and the challenge of such a commission. I'll start the band tomorrow. The pattern with the interlocked wolves would be appropriate for her position. The production and maintenance of winter clothing was not a seasonal task, but a continuous process. Even during summer, women prepared for the next winter, processing wool and producing the thread and fabric that would become essential garments months later. During winter itself, considerable time was spent on repairs. No tear was left unmended, no worn area unpatched. Clothing was too valuable and too essential to discard for minor damage. Children's garments were designed with growth in mind. Hems that could be let down, seams that could be expanded, and were passed down through siblings or between families when outgrown. Special attention was paid to clothing intended for specific winter activities. Hunting garments needed to allow silent movement. Fishing clothes required extra water resistance. Travel clothing had to balance warmth with the need to avoid overheating during exertion. For the mountain crossing, layer more thinly than you think necessary, Astrid advised her grandson Eric, who was preparing for his first winter journey with the men. You'll warm quickly on the ascent, and sweat is your enemy in the cold. You can always add layers when you stop moving. As darkness fell earlier each day and the household spent more time indoors, the textile work continued by firelight. The rhythmic movements of spinning, weaving, and sewing created not only practical necessities, but also a meditative space where stories were shared, songs sung, and young girls initiated into the essential women's knowledge that underwrote community survival. "My mother taught me to spin when I was your age," Astrid told Ingrid as they worked. She learned from her mother, who learned during the Great Winter when half the village perished. "Our family survived because they knew how to make clothing that truly kept out the cold." In this way, the creation of winter clothing bound together practical knowledge, cultural identity, gender roles, social hierarchy, and historical memory. The garments that emerged from these women's hands were more than protection against the elements. They were physical embodiments of the Norse approach to winter. Practical, resourceful, and created with the understanding that proper preparation meant the difference between life and death. As the women worked into the evening, the men of the household returned from their own winter preparations. They stomped snow from their boots at the threshold, removing outer layers that were hung near the door to dry. Within moments, their bodies registered the contrast between the bitter outdoor cold and the relative warmth of the longhouse. "The fjord is freezing at the edges," Eric reported, warming his hands at the fire. "Another week, and the ice will be thick enough for crossing." Astrid nodded, her fingers never ceasing their work with the spindle. Winter was closing in, but they were ready, wrapped in the knowledge, skill, and wool that had carried their ancestors through countless cold seasons before them. The first winter storm descended with unexpected fury, howling out of the north with winds that bent even the sturdiest pines. Inside the longhouse of Olaf Thorson, the family gathered around the central hearth, listening to the assault on their dwelling, with the particular attention of those whose lives depended on the structure's integrity. "The new roof section is holding," Olaf observed with satisfaction, glancing up at the ceiling, where steam from cooking and human breath condensed into droplets, rather than the ice that would form with any significant leak. At 53, Olaf had overseen the building or repair of enough longhouses to judge their performance with a practiced eye. The Norse longhouse represented one of humanity's most effective responses to extreme cold environments, evolving over centuries to address the unique challenges of northern winters. Unlike modern buildings, which often rely on technological systems to create artificial environments, the longhouse worked with natural principles and available materials to create a space where survival was possible even in the most brutal conditions. The typical Viking longhouse was a long, rectangular structure with rounded ends, resembling an inverted boat hull, a similarity that was no coincidence, as the same structural principles that made ships seaworthy also created buildings that could withstand winter storms. The length varied according to the status and needs of the inhabitants, from 30 feet for modest farms to over 100 feet for chieftains' halls. Construction began with a foundation of stone or packed earth, which elevated the structure slightly to prevent groundwater from seeping in during thaws. The framework consisted of wooden posts set in post holes, supporting roof-bearing beams. Walls were typically made of wattle and daub, stone, or wooden planks, depending on available materials and local conditions. The roof, supported by internal posts that divided the space into a central hall and side aisles, was typically covered with sod laid over a base layer of birch bark, which provided natural waterproofing. The thick sod layer served as insulation, keeping heat in during winter and providing natural cooling in summer. In areas where heavy snow was expected, the roof pitch was designed to shed snow before its weight could damage the structure. "The storm will test everyone's roof pitch," Olaf's wife Helga commented as she stirred the stew bubbling in the soapstone pot suspended over the fire. Old Torgrim never did fix his properly after last spring's damage. Olaf grunted in agreement. He'll be shoveling tonight, or wake to a collapse. I warned him when I saw the angle was too shallow. The central hearth was the literal and figurative heart of the longhouse. Usually a simple stone-lined pit in the middle of the floor, it provided heat, light, and cooking facilities. The smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, though never with perfect efficiency. The perpetual haze in the upper part of the structure actually served a purpose, helping to insulate the space and prevent heat from escaping too rapidly. Around the hearth, the longhouse was organized for maximum efficiency during winter confinement. Raised platforms along the walls served as seating during the day and sleeping areas at night, elevated slightly above the floor level where cold air collected. In larger households, these platforms might be enclosed with wooden partitions or curtains to create semi-private sleeping areas. Storage was integrated throughout the structure, with food and essential supplies kept in accessible locations, while less frequently needed items might be tucked into wall niches or hung from rafters. In some longhouses, a cellar pit dug into the floor provided cool storage for perishables. The architecture was sophisticated in its simplicity, reflecting an intimate understanding of thermodynamics that predated any formal scientific study. The longhouse created a microclimate that captured and managed heat from multiple sources: the central fire, cooking activities, human bodies, and sometimes livestock. The goats should come inside tonight, Helga decided, listening to the intensifying wind. The storm sounds fierce enough to kill even in a good shelter. Olaf nodded to his youngest son, who pulled on an outer cloak and hurried to the small adjoining structure where the family's most valuable animals were housed. Within minutes, he returned with 3 goats, which were tethered in a corner of the longhouse. The integration of animals into living spaces during extreme weather was a common practice, born of practicality rather than preference. The animals generated significant body heat that contributed to warming the structure, while their proximity allowed for monitoring their condition and providing care without exposing humans to dangerous cold. This pragmatic approach characterized all aspects of longhouse living. While modern sensibilities might recoil at the thought of sharing living space with livestock, smoke, and multiple human generations, the Norse understood that survival trumped comfort or contemporary notions of privacy. The winter storm continued to rage outside, wind finding every tiny gap in the structure and announcing its presence with whistles and moans. Yet inside, the temperature remained tolerable, not warm by modern standards, but well above the lethal cold beyond the walls. The new draft excluders work well, Helga observed, referring to the moss-stuffed fabric snakes that had been placed at the base of doors and shutters to block air infiltration. This simple innovation significantly reduced heat loss through gaps that would otherwise create constant cold drafts. Effective ventilation was a delicate balance in longhouse design. Too much and precious heat escaped. Too little, and smoke from the hearth could make the air unbreathable. The smoke hole in the roof featured an adjustable cover that could be partially opened or closed depending on conditions, manipulated by a long pole from below. Side vents might also be incorporated into the design, positioned to take advantage of natural air currents without creating uncomfortable drafts. The longhouse's linear design served multiple functions. Its relatively narrow width meant that heat from the central hearth could reach all areas of the structure. The length allowed for functional zoning of the space, with public areas toward the center near the main entrance, private family areas beyond, and sometimes work or storage areas at the far end. "Pass me the birch bark," Olaf requested, noticing a small area near a roof beam where melting ice indicated a minor leak. His daughter brought the requested material, watching as her father skillfully inserted a piece of the naturally waterproof bark into the small gap, diverting the moisture away from the living area. Maintenance was continuous throughout the winter, with small repairs made immediately before they could develop into larger problems. The harsh freeze-thaw cycles of northern winters were particularly hard on structures, causing materials to expand and contract in ways that could create new vulnerabilities, even in well-built longhouses. Insulation was achieved through multiple strategies. The thick walls, sometimes double-walled with moss or other insulating material packed between, provided the primary barrier against heat loss. Tapestries or animal skins hung on walls added both decoration and additional insulation. In severe cold, snow might be deliberately banked against the lower exterior walls, taking advantage of its insulating properties. Light was a precious commodity during the dark winter months. The smoke hole provided some daylight during the brief hours of sun, and smaller openings covered with translucent materials like oiled animal membrane or thin scraped hide created windows that admitted light while minimizing heat loss. For artificial light, oil lamps burning fish oil or animal fat supplemented the glow from the hearth. As the storm intensified, the family settled into their winter evening routine. The youngest children played quiet games with carved wooden figures near the fire. Older children and adults engaged in necessary indoor work, carving tools, repairing equipment, processing wool. Conversation flowed intermittently, punctuated by the crackle of the fire and the howl of wind. "Tell us about the worst winter you remember, grandfather," requested one of the children, addressing the oldest family member, who sat in a place of honor near the fire. Old Eric, approaching his 8th decade, smiled at the familiar request. "It was the winter when I was younger than you are now," he began, his voice drawing the family into a story they had heard many times but never tired of. "The snow fell for 20 days without stopping, burying the whole settlement. This too was part of the longhouse's function, not merely physical shelter but cultural continuity. Within its walls, knowledge was transmitted, skills taught, stories preserved, and community maintained through the isolating months of winter." The architecture created not only a survivable microclimate, but also a social space where the human connections essential to Norse culture could be sustained despite external conditions that forced physical isolation from the broader community. As night deepened and the storm showed no signs of abating, sleeping furs were arranged on the platforms. The fire was banked to provide continued heat through the night while minimizing the risk of sparks. The goats settled in their corner, occasionally bleating softly. "We are fortunate," Helga murmured to Olaf as they prepared for sleep. "The longhouse is strong, the stores are adequate, and the family is healthy. Odin has blessed us." Outside, temperatures plummeted, and snow piled in drifts against the walls. Inside, the family slept in relative security, protected by a structure that represented generations of accumulated knowledge about surviving winter in one of Earth's most challenging environments. The longhouse was more than a building. It was a life support system, a cultural institution, and a testament to the Norse genius for practical adaptation to their environment. Like their ships, their clothing, and their social structures, the longhouse embodied the Viking approach to winter, not denial or retreat, but thoughtful engagement with the reality of cold, using available resources and accumulated wisdom to create sustainable human space in an otherwise lethal landscape. Sigrid Håkansdottir moved carefully along the hanging rack in the storehouse, her experienced eyes evaluating each piece of dried fish. At 47, she had managed her household's food stores through enough winters to recognize the subtle signs of improper preservation. Discoloration that indicated mold, textures that suggested freezing and thawing, or odors that warned of spoilage. "This section needs to be eaten soon," she told her daughter, indicating several pieces of cod. "They didn't dry completely before the damp weather in late fall. They'll spoil by midwinter if we don't use them now." For Viking communities, winter survival depended on a complex system of food preservation and careful management of stored provisions. Without modern refrigeration, freezing, or canning technologies, they relied on methods developed and refined over generations: drying, smoking, fermenting, pickling, and salt curing, along with the natural refrigeration provided by cold weather itself. The process began in the abundant months of summer and early autumn, when the brief northern growing season yielded its harvest and fish and game were at their fattest. Every household engaged in a carefully orchestrated effort to preserve as much food as possible for the barren months ahead. Fish was a dietary staple for most Norse communities, particularly those near the coast or major waterways. Various preservation methods were employed depending on the type of fish and intended storage duration. The simplest was air drying, where split fish were hung on wooden racks exposed to the cold, dry air and wind, which naturally preserved the meat by removing moisture that bacteria needed to grow. Smoking added another layer of preservation, with fish hung in special structures where controlled wood smoke both dried the meat and imparted antimicrobial compounds that further deterred spoilage. Salt curing, while dependent on valuable salt, often obtained through trade or coastal evaporation, created products that could last for years if properly stored. A particularly distinctive Norse preserved fish was lutefisk, created by soaking dried fish in lye solution before reconstituting it for eating, a process that significantly altered the texture and flavor while extending preservation time. Another was gravlax, where raw salmon was cured with salt, sugar, and dill, then buried to ferment slightly before consumption. Meat preservation followed similar principles, but with techniques adapted to different animals. The autumn slaughter provided the bulk of the winter's meat supply, which had to be processed quickly before it could spoil. "The smoked mutton from the old ram is ready," Sigrid noted as she continued her inspection. "But save it for later in the winter. We should eat the fresh frozen meat while the cold weather ensures its preservation." Natural freezing was indeed one of the simplest preservation methods available in the northern climate. Certain storage structures were designed to maintain temperatures below freezing, allowing meat to be preserved in essentially fresh condition. However, this method was vulnerable to unexpected thaws, requiring constant monitoring and rapid consumption of anything that began to defrost. For longer-term storage, smoking was again a primary method, with joints of meat hung in smokehouses until they developed the characteristic dark exterior and firm texture that indicated proper preservation. Salt curing created strongly flavored preserved meats similar to modern jerky. Perhaps the most distinctive meat preservation technique was fermentation, which produced strongly flavored products that remained edible for extended periods. Hakarl, fermented shark, and surmeter, fermented lamb, exemplified this approach, which took advantage of controlled bacterial action to transform raw meat into preserved products with distinctive flavors. "The sour meat should be ready by midwinter," Sigrid told her family. "We'll need its strength when the darkness is deepest." This comment reflected another aspect of Viking food management: the strategic deployment of different foods according to their properties and the changing needs of the household through the winter months. Fermented foods, high in certain nutrients that might be lacking in other preserved options, were often saved for the deepest part of winter, when fresh food was most scarce and the psychological challenge of darkness most intense. Plant foods required their own preservation strategies. Grains, primarily barley, oats, and rye, formed the backbone of the winter diet, stored as whole grains to prevent spoilage and ground into flour as needed. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and beets could be stored in root cellars, where controlled temperature and humidity preserved them in nearly fresh condition for months. Fruits were more challenging to preserve, but vital for their nutritional content. Berries, particularly lingonberries, cloudberries, and crowberries, were often preserved in honey or simply dried. Apples might be sliced and dried or stored in cool, dry conditions, where they would gradually dehydrate without rotting. Herbs and greens, essential for both flavor and nutrition, were typically dried and stored in bundles hanging from rafters. Some, like angelica and sorrel, were specifically harvested for their vitamin content, recognized through experience as preventing the mysterious ailments, now known to be caused by vitamin deficiencies, that could afflict people during long winters. The children should have dried angelica with their porridge, Sigrid instructed her daughter. It prevents the bleeding sickness that took neighbor Finn's youngest 2 winters ago. Food storage spaces were as carefully designed as living quarters. Root cellars utilized the insulating properties of earth to maintain temperatures just above freezing for vegetables. Dedicated storehouses were constructed to protect dried and smoked foods from moisture and pests, while allowing sufficient air circulation to prevent condensation. Some communities created collective storage facilities, often partially underground, where perishable foods could be maintained at low temperatures. The daily winter diet that emerged from this complex preservation system was far more varied than modern stereotypes of bland historical food might suggest, though certainly more limited than the fresh abundance of summer. A typical winter day might begin with a porridge of mixed grains, perhaps flavored with dried berries or honey if available. The main meal, usually taken in the middle of the day to take advantage of daylight for eating, could feature preserved fish or meat, often in a stew with stored root vegetables and dried herbs. Evening might bring a simpler meal of bread or leftovers from the main meal. Dairy products played an important role in the winter diet when available. Milk production naturally declined in winter, but preserved dairy in the form of cheese, butter, and skyr, a yogurt-like cultured milk product, provided valuable fat and protein. These were often produced in quantity during the summer milk surplus, specifically for winter consumption. The new cheese has aged well, Sigrid noted with satisfaction, as she cut a small piece from a large wheel stored in the coolest corner of the storehouse. The extra salt I added has kept it perfectly. Beverages were another essential consideration. Water was always available in the form of snow or ice, but warm drinks were preferred in cold weather. Ale, produced from fermented grain, provided both hydration and calories, while mead, fermented honey, offered similar benefits with different flavors. Both contained alcohol, which provided a sensation of warmth through vasodilation, though experienced Norse people understood that excessive consumption in cold weather could be dangerous by drawing heat to the body's surface, where it would be lost more rapidly. Herbal teas made from dried leaves, berries, and roots provided non-alcoholic alternatives, often selected for specific medicinal properties as well as flavor. Pine needle tea, rich in vitamin C, was one common option, that helped prevent scurvy during the months when fresh fruits and vegetables were unavailable. The careful management of winter food stores was a continuous process requiring knowledge, judgment, and discipline. Households had to balance immediate needs against the uncertain duration of winter, always keeping a reserve for emergencies while ensuring that nothing was wasted through spoilage. "We'll need to reduce our portions of grain starting next week," Sigrid informed her family after completing her inventory. "The winter is proving longer than expected, and we must make the stores last until spring fishing begins." This kind of adjustment was normal and expected. Unlike modern consumers, accustomed to consistent portions regardless of external conditions, Norse people understood that consumption had to be calibrated to availability, with flexibility built into expectations. The winter diet also reflected social hierarchies. In chieftains' halls and wealthy households, imported luxury foods like wheat flour, certain spices, or southern fruits might supplement the local preserved goods. Even in more modest households, special foods were reserved for celebrations or particularly difficult periods when morale needed boosting. "We'll open the honeycomb at Yule," Sigrid promised the children, who looked forward to this special treat saved from the previous summer's harvest. "And perhaps some of the dried apples, if you continue to help without complaint." Food sharing was another important aspect of Norse winter survival. While each household was expected to prepare for its own needs, community support for those in difficulty was a cultural norm. This might take the form of direct gifts of food to those whose stores ran short, or more commonly, invitations to share meals during times of scarcity. "Take some of the smoked fish to Widow Greta," Sigrid instructed her son. Her root cellar flooded during the last thaw, and she's lost much of her vegetable store. This community approach to food security represented an understanding that collective survival depended on maintaining the strength of all members. A family that starved not only suffered personal tragedy, but represented a loss to the community's overall resilience and working capacity. As winter progressed, the diet gradually changed, reflecting both the diminishing stores and the body's changing needs. More calorie-dense foods might be emphasized during the coldest periods, while stored vitamins in the form of preserved fruits or specific herbs were strategically deployed to prevent deficiency diseases. By late winter, stores were typically at their lowest ebb, creating what was known as the hunger time, before spring brought renewed access to fresh food. During this period, alternative food sources gained importance. Ice fishing, hunting of winter-active animals, collection of inner bark from certain trees, or harvesting of seaweeds in coastal areas. "Tomorrow the men will try fishing through the ice again," Sigrid told her daughter, as they carefully measured out grain for the next day's meals. "And you should take the children to gather pine bark. It will stretch our flour if ground and added to the bread." These late winter strategies reflected the Norse people's intimate knowledge of their environment and its resources. Even at the seemingly barren end of winter, they knew where to find emergency nutrition that could sustain them until spring's renewal. The Vikings' approach to winter food: careful preservation, strategic consumption, community sharing, and emergency alternatives, represented a sophisticated response to their environment's extreme seasonality. Their methods, developed through generations of trial, error, and innovation, created a food system that, while never free from the risk of shortage, provided sufficient nutrition to maintain active, functioning communities through the darkest and coldest months of the northern year. The metallic scrape of steel against stone echoed through the workshop as Bjorn Ketilson sharpened the blade of his ice chisel. Outside, the midwinter sun barely cleared the horizon, casting long blue shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Soon he would join the other men at the frozen lake, where the day's ice fishing would provide a welcome supplement to the dwindling stored provisions. "Check the binding on the blade," advised his father Kettle, who sat nearby repairing a snowshoe. "If it comes loose on the lake, you'll lose both fish and tool." Bjorn nodded and tested the rawhide lashings that secured the iron blade to its wooden handle, tightening them where needed. The ice chisel was just one of dozens of specialized tools that the Norse people had developed to navigate and exploit their winter environment. Technologies that transformed a potentially deadly season into one where not just survival, but productivity remained possible. Winter mobility represented one of the greatest challenges in the snow-covered north. The same landscape that might take a day to traverse in summer could require 3 in winter if approached with the wrong equipment, or conversely, could be crossed in half the time with the right tools and techniques. The ski was perhaps the most significant Norse contribution to winter transportation technology. Archaeological evidence dates ski use in Scandinavia to at least 4000 BCE, with continuous refinement leading to the sophisticated designs used during the Viking Age. Unlike modern matched pairs, early Norse skis often featured one long sliding ski and one shorter kicking ski covered with animal skin for traction, a combination that effectively addressed the varied terrain they navigated. "Your cousin will need to borrow the forest skis," Kettle mentioned, referring to a particularly sturdy pair designed for travel through wooded areas. "He's checking the trap lines tomorrow in the western valleys." Ski designs varied according to their intended use. Forest skis tended to be shorter and wider for maneuverability among trees, while field skis, used for open terrain, were longer and narrower for greater speed. All featured a curved-up tip to ride over snow and a groove along the bottom that improved straight-line stability, design elements still found in modern cross-country skis. A single ski pole, much longer than modern versions, was used for propulsion, steering, and as a multi-purpose tool. The pole might feature a small metal blade for testing snow depth or ice thickness, a hook for manipulating objects without removing mittens, or a sharpened end that could serve as a hunting spear in an emergency. For areas where skiing was impractical, snowshoes provided an alternative. Norse snowshoes were typically wooden frames with leather lacings, creating a surface area that distributed the wearer's weight and prevented sinking into deep snow. Different designs served different conditions. Larger ones for powdery snow, smaller and more maneuverable versions for packed trails or forested areas. "The binding on this one needs replacing," Kettle muttered, examining a worn leather strap on the snowshoe he was repairing. "Bjorn, bring me some of that deer hide we tanned last month. It's strong but still flexible enough for snowshoe work." Winter travel also required specialized sleds and sledges for transporting goods. The simplest were acadia, boat-shaped containers that could be pulled by person or animal over snow, while more elaborate designs featured runners optimized for different snow conditions. For ice travel, smaller sledges with metal shod runners allowed heavy loads to be moved with minimal effort across frozen lakes or sea ice. Animal transport adapted to winter conditions as well. Horses were fitted with special winter shoes, featuring cleats for traction on ice, while in the far north, domesticated reindeer pulled sleds designed for deep snow conditions. Dogs, while not commonly used for pulling in most Norse areas, sometimes assisted hunters by wearing small packs or dragging light sledges. Navigation presented its own challenges in a winter landscape where familiar landmarks might be obscured by snow and daylight hours were limited. The Norse developed sophisticated understanding of natural direction indicators. the position of the sun, even when partially obscured by clouds, wind patterns that remained consistent in certain regions, snow formations shaped by prevailing winds, and at night, the stars, particularly the North Star, Polaris, which they called Leitherstjerne, the guiding star. Always remember, Ketil instructed his son, if you're lost in winter, find running water and follow it downhill. It will lead to larger water, which will lead to settlements. Winter survival depended not just on movement, but on the ability to create shelter in emergency situations. The Norse carried the knowledge to quickly construct snow shelters, similar to what Inuit people call quinzee. Simple mounds of snow hollowed out to create insulated spaces that could prevent freezing to death during unexpected storms. More elaborate snow houses might be built for longer hunting expeditions or travel between distant settlements. Fire-starting equipment was considered essential winter gear, carried in waterproof containers to ensure reliability regardless of conditions. The typical kit included a striker, often high-carbon steel, flint, char cloth, and tinder materials, selected for their ability to catch sparks even when the surrounding environment was damp or frozen. Check your fire kit before you leave, Ketil reminded Bjorn. No matter how brief the trip, never travel in winter without the means to make fire. Fishing technology adapted specifically to winter conditions represented some of the most ingenious Norse innovations. Ice fishing required specialized tools. The ice chisel Bjorn was sharpening would create holes through ice that might be several feet thick. Specialized rods were shorter than summer versions for use while sitting close to the ice hole. And small shelters might be erected over productive fishing spots to block wind and retain heat during extended fishing sessions. Fish were attracted using carved wooden lures, often decorated with bits of colored cloth or feathers, jigged at varying depths until a strike was felt. Lines made from horsehair or plant fibers were strong enough to land good-sized fish, but required careful handling to prevent freezing and becoming brittle in sub-zero temperatures. Winter hunting technologies were equally specialized. Bows were carefully maintained to prevent the laminated wood and horn from separating in cold conditions. Arrows for winter hunting often featured broader heads designed to create larger wound channels that would bleed more profusely, making animals easier to track in snow. Trapping became particularly important during winter when game was scarcer and conserving human energy more critical. Trap lines, sequences of set traps checked regularly, might extend for miles through territories known to harbor winter-active animals like fox, marten, or hare. The traps themselves ranged from simple snares to elaborate box traps designed to keep captured animals alive and unfrozen until the trappers return. The wooden trigger on the large trap needs replacing, Bjorn noted, examining the equipment laid out for the next day's expedition. The cold has made it brittle. His father nodded. Use birch for the new one. It stays flexible even in the worst cold. This observation highlighted another aspect of Norse winter technology, the careful selection of materials based on their properties in cold conditions. Certain woods remained flexible, while others became dangerously brittle. Some metals conducted cold so efficiently they could cause instant frostbite if touched with bare skin, while others could be handled safely. Hides and leathers were chosen for specific applications based on how they responded to moisture and freezing. The Norse understanding of these material properties represented sophisticated empirical science, developed through observation and experience, rather than formal experimentation, but no less effective for that difference in methodology. Tools for working in winter conditions featured adaptations for use with mittened hands, larger grips, loops that could accommodate bulky handwear, and designs that minimize the need for fine motor control. Wood and bone, materials that don't conduct cold as readily as metal, were used for handles and grips whenever possible. Use the horn spoon for eating on the ice, Kettle advised. The metal one will freeze to your lips before you know it. Timekeeping and weather prediction represented another category of winter technology, though in forms less tangible than physical tools. The Norse developed detailed understanding of natural indicators that foretold weather changes. Cloud formations that preceded storms, animal behaviors that signaled temperature shifts, subtle changes in snow texture or air moisture that experienced individuals could detect before storms arrived. The sky to the north has mare's tails, Bjorn observed, glancing out the workshop door. Snow by tomorrow evening. Kettle followed his son's gaze and nodded agreement. We'll fish until midday tomorrow, then return before it hits. The ice will be safest in early morning, while the air is still clear. As the brief winter daylight began to fade, Bjorn finished his preparations, organizing the ice fishing gear into a bundle that could be easily transported on a small sledge. Everything was checked, adjusted, and secured, a process repeated countless times across the Norse lands as people prepared for winter activities where equipment failure could mean injury or death. The tools and technologies they developed weren't just practical responses to environmental challenges, but expressions of cultural values, self-reliance, resourcefulness, and pragmatic innovation. Each generation refined what they inherited, adapting designs based on experience and changing conditions, creating a technological tradition perfectly attuned to the demands of northern winters. As Bjorn and Kettle extinguished the workshop lamps and moved toward the main house where the evening meal awaited, they carried with them the security of knowing that tomorrow's expedition would be undertaken with equipment tested by generations before them. Tools that transformed winter from an implacable enemy into a challenging but navigable season, one where skilled humans could not merely survive, but thrive. The longest night of the year descended over the Norse settlement of Hedeby like a heavy fur cloak, wrapping the community in darkness, broken only by scattered points of firelight. Yet, unlike ordinary winter evenings, when families retreated to individual longhouses soon after sundown, tonight, the pathways between buildings bustled with activity. Bundled figures carrying torches moved purposefully through the settlement, converging on the great hall where smoke billowed from the roof opening and golden light spilled from every crack around doors and shutters. Inside the hall, Jarl Magnus Haraldsson surveyed the preparations with satisfaction. At 60, the Jarl had overseen more Yule celebrations than he could count, but the ancient midwinter festival never lost its significance. Particularly in this year of difficult harvests and early winter storms, the community needed the psychological and spiritual renewal that Yule provided. The sacrifice is prepared, reported Thorvald, the local Gothi priest, who would oversee the religious aspects of the celebration. The boar is the finest from this year's herd. The Jarl nodded approval. The sacrifice of a boar to Freyr, god of fertility and prosperity, formed the ceremonial heart of Yule, symbolizing the community's investment in future abundance, even as they consumed precious winter stores. Across the Norse lands, from Denmark to Iceland, similar preparations were underway as communities prepared to mark the turning point of winter. While Christian influence had begun to affect some regions during the late Viking Age, bringing elements of Christmas into the traditional celebration, most communities still observed Yule according to ancient practice, a critical cultural mechanism for managing the psychological challenge of midwinter darkness. The timing of Yule was determined by the winter solstice, the shortest day and longest night of the year, typically falling between December 20 to 23 in the modern calendar. The festival itself lasted at least 3 days and nights, though wealthier communities might extend celebrations for up to 12 days. "Are the swearing stones in place?" the Jarl asked, referring to the stones that would be used during one of the festival's most important rituals. "Yes, Lord," Thorvald confirmed. "They await your oath and those of the men." This ritual, the swearing of solemn oaths on a sacrificial boar or on sacred stones, was central to Yule's social function. Men would publicly commit to important undertakings for the coming year, making their intentions known to the community and placing their honor on the line. These Yule oaths were considered especially binding, sworn as they were at the pivot point between the old year and the new. As darkness deepened outside, more villagers arrived at the hall, each family bringing contributions to the communal feast. Despite winter scarcity, Yule was a time of deliberate abundance, a psychological counterbalance to the physical reality of the season. Stored foods reserved specifically for this celebration were brought forth, representing the community's confidence that they had sufficient resources to feast now and still survive until spring. "Place the ale casks by the north wall," directed Hildy, the Jarl's wife, as serving women arranged the hall for the feast. "And make sure the special honeyed mead is accessible for the ritual toasts." Alcohol played a significant role in Yule celebrations, with special brews often prepared months in advance. Beyond its intoxicating properties, which helped loosen the psychological constraints of winter's hardship, the shared drinking reinforced community bonds and participated in the ritual structure of the festival. Outside the hall, younger members of the community completed another essential Yule preparation: the gathering and arrangement of evergreen branches throughout the settlement. These symbols of persistent life amid winter's apparent death served both decorative and spiritual purposes, reminding the community that beneath the snow, life continued and would return in force. "The Yule log is ready, Father," reported Ulf, the Jarl's youngest son, referring to the massive oak log that had been selected at the previous year's celebration and seasoned for 12 months, specifically for this purpose. The Yule log represented one of the festival's most ancient elements, a ritual focusing on the preservation and regeneration of fire, that most essential winter resource. Selected for its size and quality, the log would be ceremonially brought into the hall and set ablaze, ideally burning continuously throughout the Yule celebration. Brands from this fire might be used to light household hearths, symbolically distributing the communal flame to individual families. As the final preparations concluded, the Jarl donned his finest clothing and a ceremonial cloak fastened with elaborate brooches that had been passed down through generations of his family. His wife similarly dressed in her best attire, including jewelry reserved for the most important occasions. Even common villagers wore their finest garments, many saving special clothes specifically for Yule, regardless of their limited wardrobes. "It is time," Thorvald announced as the last daylight faded completely. "The sun dies its deepest death tonight, and we must help ensure its rebirth." The ceremony began with a procession that moved from the hall to the sacred grove outside the settlement, where the sacrificial boar awaited. Torches illuminated the path through snow-covered ground, their flames representing the community's defiance of winter darkness. Chants and songs accompanied the procession, their lyrics preserving myths and stories central to Norse understanding of the season's cycle. At the grove, Thorvald conducted the sacrifice with solemn precision, dedicating the boar to Freyr with prayers for fertility, prosperity, and the sun's return. The animal's blood was collected in bowls, then used to bless both the sacred space and the participants, creating a connection between the divine and human realms at this crucial juncture of the year. With this blood, we renew our bond with the gods, the Gothi intoned, dipping a bundle of evergreen branches into the crimson liquid and sprinkling it over the assembled community members. As they sustain us through the dark time, so shall we honor them with our faithfulness. Following the sacrifice, the procession returned to the hall, bringing the sanctified boar that would form the centerpiece of the feast. The Yule log was ceremonially lit, with prayers to Thor for protection through the remainder of winter, and to Odin for wisdom in managing whatever challenges the season might still bring. As the community gathered around the long tables, the jarl rose for the first of many ritual toasts that would punctuate the evening. First to Odin, the Allfather, for wisdom in these dark times, he proclaimed, raising an ornate drinking horn. After drinking deeply, he passed the horn to his wife, who continued the pattern with a toast to Frigg, Odin's wife and goddess of the household. The horn continued around the gathering, with toasts to various gods appropriate to the season and the community's needs. The feast itself represented a deliberate contrast to everyday winter meals, abundant, varied, and rich in rare ingredients. Meat featured prominently, with the sacrificial boar as the centerpiece, supplemented by other preserved meats brought out from storage. Bread made from the finest available flour, usually reserved for special occasions, accompanied the meat, along with preserved fruits, nuts, and any vegetables that could be successfully stored until midwinter. "This Yule bread is even better than last year's," commented an elderly woman, as she savored the special loaf made with honey, dried fruits, and precious spices. "Ingrid has outdone herself." The baker beamed at the compliment, her pride evident. Though everyday cooking was essential, the special foods prepared for Yule represented creativity and artistry beyond mere nutrition. Another way the festival elevated the community above winter's utilitarian focus on mere survival. As the feasting continued, the hall filled with conversation, laughter, and song. Stories were shared, some sacred myths appropriate to the season, others entertaining sagas of heroes and adventures, and some simply amusing anecdotes from daily life. This oral tradition served not merely as entertainment, but as cultural preservation, passing down collective wisdom and shared identity through generations. "Tell us about the time you sailed to Miklagard," a young boy requested of a weather-beaten old warrior, referring to Constantinople, modern Istanbul, the magnificent Byzantine capital occasionally visited by Norse traders and warriors. The old man smiled, launching into a well-practiced tale of distant lands where winter was but a pale shadow of the northern version. His audience listened raptly, temporarily transported beyond their snowbound settlement to imagined worlds of warmth and exotic wonders. Such stories served a crucial psychological function during the isolation of winter, broadening mental horizons even as physical ones contracted. They reminded the community that the world extended beyond their immediate circumstances, and that spring would eventually reconnect them with that broader reality. As night deepened, the oath-taking ceremony began. Men approached the jarl, one by one, placing their hands on the sacred stones or on the head of the sacrificial boar, and publicly proclaimed the deeds they intended to accomplish in the coming year. Some vowed practical achievements, building projects, trading expeditions, or craft improvements. Others made more personal commitments, the resolution of long-standing feuds, marriage arrangements, or spiritual dedications. I, Gunnar Thorson, swear by the gods to lead the spring trading voyage to the eastern lands and return with iron sufficient for the village's tools, proclaimed one respected merchant. I, Leif Erikson, vow to make peace with the family of Halvard, whom I wounded in anger last harvest, declared another man, addressing a conflict that had simmered dangerously through the early winter. Each oath was witnessed by the entire community and sealed with a ritual drink. The public nature of these commitments created accountability, while the religious context added supernatural enforcement. Breaking a Yule oath was believed to bring divine disfavor. After the formal oaths, the celebration shifted toward entertainment and revelry. Music featured prominently, with instruments including simple drums, bone flutes, stringed lyres, and frame harps providing accompaniment to songs both sacred and secular. Some songs followed traditional patterns, with lyrics changed to address current community concerns or recent events. Dancing occupied a significant place in the festivities, with forms ranging from dignified circular movements to more energetic displays. Like other Yule activities, dance served multiple purposes: physical exercise during a season of confinement, social bonding through synchronized movement, and for some dances, ritual significance related to fertility and the turning of the year. Games and competitions provided another form of entertainment, while building skills valuable for survival. Tests of strength, agility, and wit engaged participants of all ages, with prizes adding incentive beyond mere victory. Some games had religious or divinatory aspects, with outcomes interpreted as omens for the coming year. "The dice favor you tonight," observed an older man as a youth won his third consecutive game. "Perhaps Thor will favor your first raid come summer." Throughout the long night, the celebration continued, designed to occupy the full duration of darkness at this critical turning point. While practical considerations might have suggested conserving resources by sleeping through the extended night, the Norse approach instead invested those resources in collective psychological sustenance, creating a reservoir of social cohesion and emotional resilience that would help carry the community through the remaining winter. As the first faint lightening of the eastern sky finally announced dawn after the year's longest night, the celebration reached another ceremonial moment. The community gathered outside, many having remained awake through the entire night to witness and welcome the sun's return. "The light returns," proclaimed Thorvald as the first direct sunlight touched the settlement. "The wheel turns again towards summer." This observation of the sun's rebirth after the solstice represented the cosmological heart of Yule. Though the Norse understood the cyclical nature of seasons, the emotional and spiritual significance of the sun's return remained profound, particularly in northern communities where midwinter might bring mere hours of weak daylight, or in the far north, none at all for weeks. Following this sunrise observance, many celebrants finally sought rest, though the Yule festivities would continue for several more days. Each day featured different emphases and activities. Some focused on particular gods or goddesses, others on specific community needs or traditional practices. The psychological benefits of Yule extended well beyond the celebration itself. The festival created a marker halfway through winter, dividing an otherwise daunting expanse of darkness and cold into more manageable segments. It provided a store of shared positive experiences that could be drawn upon during the difficult months still ahead. And perhaps most importantly, it reinforced the community's confidence in their collective ability to withstand winter's challenges. As the Jarl finally retired to his private quarters after overseeing the sunrise ritual, his wife noted the lines of fatigue on his face, but also the satisfaction in his eyes. "A successful Yule," she observed. "The gods have been honored, the community fed and entertained, and important oaths sworn." The Jarl nodded. "We reminded ourselves that even the longest night ends, and that together we are strong enough to endure whatever winter still brings. This was Yule's greatest gift to the Norse people. Not merely a break from winter's hardship, but a cultural technology for transforming the season's greatest challenge into an opportunity for renewal. By directly confronting the darkness, rather than merely enduring it, they converted midwinter from winter's nadir into a turning point of hope and communal strength. The winter storm had howled for 3 days straight, burying the small settlement of Vestfjord in snowdrifts taller than a man. Inside the longhouse of Snorri the Skald, 23 people, 3 families who had sought shelter when the storm began, sat gathered around the central hearth, their faces illuminated by flickering firelight as darkness once again descended outside. "Tell us about the creation of the world," requested young Thora, a girl of perhaps 7 winters, "about the giant Ymir and how his body became the earth." Snorri smiled at the child. At 65, he had earned his reputation as one of the region's most respected storytellers through decades of preserving and performing the tales that formed the backbone of Norse cultural identity. Though not a Gothi, priest in the formal sense, his role in maintaining the community's spiritual and cultural knowledge gave him similar status, particularly during the confined winter months when his skills became essential to collective well-being. "Very well," he agreed, taking a sip of warm mead to prepare his voice for what might be hours of speaking. "But first, let us ensure everyone is comfortable, for the tale of creation is long and winds through many paths." As the assembled listeners adjusted their positions on benches and furs surrounding the fire, Snorri observed them with practiced eyes. He noted the restlessness of the younger children, the visible exhaustion of adults who had spent the day managing dwindling supplies and maintaining the structure against the storm's assault, and the particular tension in the shoulders of Leif and Bjorn, 2 neighbors whose long-standing dispute over hunting territories threatened to erupt into open conflict if left unaddressed. All of this would inform how he shaped his telling tonight. Storytelling among the Norse was never merely entertainment, but a sophisticated cultural technology serving multiple purposes: preserving essential knowledge, reinforcing social bonds, transmitting values, easing psychological burdens, and sometimes even resolving conflicts too delicate to address directly. Clearing his throat, Snorri began in the traditional manner, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality that immediately commanded attention. In the beginning, there was nothing but the great void called Ginnungagap. To the north lay Niflheim, the world of ice and mist. To the south, Muspelheim, the realm of fire. Where the ice of Niflheim met the heat of Muspelheim in Ginnungagap, the frozen venom began to thaw and drip. From these drops formed Ymir, the first frost giant. As Snorri's voice filled the longhouse, the audience visibly settled. Children who had been fidgeting grew still, their eyes wide with wonder. Adults whose faces had shown the strain of the storm's confinement relaxed, transported beyond their immediate circumstances to the mythic time of creation. This was the first function of winter storytelling: escape. The physical confinement of winter, when blizzards might keep a family or even an entire settlement housebound for days, created psychological pressure that stories helped relieve by expanding mental horizons even as physical ones contracted. Snorri continued through the complex creation myth, describing how the gods Odin, Vili, and Ve slew the giant Ymir and fashioned the world from his body, the earth from his flesh, mountains from his bones, the sea from his blood, the sky from his skull. His delivery emphasized elements that resonated with the winter experience: the triumph of order over chaos, the establishment of boundaries that created safe space for humans in a hostile cosmos, the conversion of threat into resource. And from Ymir's eyebrows, the gods made Midgard, the middle realm where humans dwell, protected from the giants who would destroy them. Snorri intoned, his gesture encompassing the longhouse where they sheltered from winter's assault, a parallel not lost on his listeners. Young Thora had been joined by other children who pressed closer to the fire, and the storyteller, their usual evening restlessness, transformed into rapt attention. This represented another critical function of winter storytelling: education. In a culture without formal schools, stories served as the primary vehicle for transmitting knowledge across generations. The creation myth Snorri recounted contained essential cosmological concepts that oriented Norse people within their world. Other tales in his repertoire taught practical skills, ethical principles, historical events, and geographic knowledge. The winter months, when outdoor work was limited, provided the time for this crucial knowledge transfer that might be neglected during the busy seasons of planting, herding, fishing, and harvesting. As Snorri's initial tale concluded, he paused to sip mead and gauge his audience. The adults appeared more relaxed, but he noted that Leif and Bjorn, seated on opposite sides of the hearth, still maintained their distance and tension. Now I will tell you of Thor's journey to Utgard-Loki, Snorri announced, selecting a tale that mixed humor with deeper messages about appearances versus reality, and one that might speak indirectly to the simmering conflict between the two men. This represented a third function of winter storytelling: social regulation. Through tales that emphasized certain values or illustrated the consequences of antisocial behavior, storytellers reinforced cultural norms and offered indirect commentary on current community dynamics. Rather than confronting tensions directly, which might escalate conflict in a confined winter space, a skilled storyteller could address them obliquely through strategically chosen narratives. As Snorri recounted Thor's humbling experiences in the giant's castle, where what seemed like simple contests were actually impossible cosmic feats in disguise, laughter periodically erupted from the audience. The god of thunder's frustration at his apparent failures, followed by the revelation that he had actually performed miracles, provided both entertainment and subtle wisdom about judging situations accurately. The tale contained lessons about pride, humility, and the danger of underestimating opponents, all relevant to the dispute between Leif and Bjorn, whose conflict had begun when each claimed to have tracked and killed the same elk during the autumn hunt. Neither would admit the possibility they might both be partly wrong about the sequence of events, and their stubbornness threatened to divide allies just when winter cooperation was most needed. Storytelling sessions like this one occurred throughout the long winter in every Norse settlement, from the humblest farmstead to the grandest Jarl's Hall. While the setting and sophistication might vary, the essential functions remained the same: preservation of cultural knowledge, strengthening of community bonds, entertainment during confinement, psychological release, and indirect conflict management. In larger settlements, professional skalds like Snorri might be retained specifically for their storytelling abilities. These poet-performers composed and memorized vast repertoires of tales, often setting them to meter, and sometimes accompanying themselves on simple stringed instruments like the tuggelharpa. The most formal of these compositions were intended as historical records, preserving the deeds of kings, heroes, and notable community members. Others recounted the adventures of gods and giants, explained natural phenomena, or simply entertained with tales of trickery, romance, or exotic travels. While the performance style of each skald was unique, they shared certain techniques that made their stories memorable and effective. Repetition of key phrases helped audiences remember central points, Vivid imagery engaged the senses, creating immersive experiences that distracted from winter's monotony. Humor provided emotional release, while moments of suspense created shared anticipation that bound listeners together in communal experience. As evening deepened into night, Snorri moved through several more tales, carefully selecting each to serve multiple purposes. A recounting of Odin's sacrifice to gain the wisdom of the runes, hanging 9 days from the world tree, wounded by his own spear, spoke to the Norse ethos that valued knowledge gained through hardship, particularly relevant during winter's challenges. What seems like suffering may be the path to power, Snorri noted as he concluded the tale. As Odin's ordeal gave him mastery of the runes, so might winter's trials strengthen us for spring's opportunities. This philosophical framing of seasonal hardship was characteristic of Norse winter storytelling, which often transformed the negative aspects of the season into meaningful challenges or even spiritual opportunities. Rather than simply enduring winter, stories encouraged people to engage with it as a purposeful phase in the cycle of existence. By the time Snorri concluded his performance with a light-hearted tale of Loki's misadventures, selected to end the evening on a note of humor, the atmosphere in the longhouse had transformed. The physical circumstances remained unchanged. The storm still raged outside, supplies were still limited, and the space was still crowded. But psychologically, the community had shifted. Children drifted toward sleep with images of cosmic creation rather than howling winds filling their minds. Adults engaged in quiet conversation, their earlier tension dissipated by hours of shared experience. Even Leif and Bjorn had gradually shifted position during the stories, moving incrementally closer to the hearth until they now sat almost side by side, their dispute temporarily forgotten as they discussed a point from one of the tales. Your telling of Thor's fishing for the Midgard serpent reminded me of last summer's expedition to the Outer Islands, Leif commented to Bjorn, referencing an expedition they had undertaken together before their conflict began. Remember how your line caught on what we thought was the bottom, but turned out to be that enormous skate? Bjorn laughed, the shared memory momentarily more powerful than their disagreement. It nearly pulled you overboard. If I hadn't grabbed your belt, you'd have joined the fish in the deep. This subtle movement toward reconciliation illustrated another vital function of winter storytelling: the maintenance of social bonds that might otherwise fray under the pressure of confinement. By creating a shared experience that transcended immediate circumstances, stories reminded community members of their deeper connections and common culture. As the gathered families prepared for sleep, arranging their bedding around the central hearth, Snorri observed with satisfaction the effects of the evening's tales. Tomorrow, the storm might end, allowing normal activities to resume, or it might continue, requiring another night of stories. Either way, the community was better equipped to face whatever came. Winter storytelling among the Norse wasn't merely a pastime, but a sophisticated cultural practice that addressed the season's unique challenges: isolation, confinement, darkness, and resource scarcity. Through their rich oral tradition, they transformed the potentially demoralizing experience of winter into an opportunity for cultural transmission, community building, entertainment, and even spiritual development. As the flames died down to embers and silence gradually replaced the sound of Snorri's voice, the storm's howl seemed less threatening than before. The tales remained, hanging in the air like a protective tapestry against winter's assault. Not by denying the reality of cold and dark, but by giving it meaning within the larger pattern of existence. The wind died suddenly, as if sliced off by a knife, leaving an unnatural silence more unsettling than the storm's howl. Freydis Halldórsdóttir paused in her work at the loom, feeling a familiar prickle at the back of her neck, the sensation her grandmother had taught her to recognize as the presence of the divine breaking through into the human world. "Odin rides tonight," she murmured, her breath visible in the suddenly colder air of the longhouse. Her husband Halldor looked up from the fishing net he was repairing, his expression skeptical but not dismissive. At 48, he had seen enough inexplicable occurrences to maintain a cautious respect for his wife's intuitions, particularly regarding the gods. "The wild hunt?" he asked, referring to the spectral procession said to tear through winter skies during the darkest nights, led by the Allfather himself. Freydis nodded, moving to check that the door was securely barred. "The signs are all present. Sudden silence after storm, the feeling of watching eyes and look." She pointed to where their dog Freaky lay curled by the hearth, whimpering softly with his paws over his muzzle. "The animals sense it too?" For the Norse people, winter was not merely a season of physical challenge, but a spiritually charged time when the boundaries between worlds grew thin, and the gods and other supernatural beings became more active in human affairs. Their rich mythology provided both explanation for winter's hardships and guidance for navigating its dangers, creating a framework that transformed mere survival into meaningful participation in cosmic patterns. The wild hunt represented one of winter's most feared supernatural manifestations, a procession of ghostly riders led by Odin, thundering across storm-filled skies. Those who witnessed the hunt might be carried off to join its eternal ride, while those who mocked it could be struck dead or driven mad. The only protection was to stay indoors on nights when the hunt rode, avoiding its notice and respecting its power. "I'll tell the children to stay away from the smoke hole tonight," Halldor decided, taking no chances despite his natural pragmatism. "No gazing at the stars, even if the clouds break." This blend of caution and belief characterized the Norse approach to winter spirituality. While they were practical people, not given to needless superstition, they recognized winter as a season when ordinary rules might be suspended and extraordinary precautions justified. At the center of Norse winter mythology stood the figure of Odin, the wandering, one-eyed Allfather whose complex nature perfectly embodied winter's paradoxes. As leader of the wild hunt, he represented winter's terror. As the god of wisdom, poetry, and magic, he personified the creative introspection that winter's confinement made possible. As a war god associated with death, he reflected winter's harsh winnowing of the weak. And as the divine seeker of knowledge who sacrificed himself on Yggdrasil to gain the wisdom of the runes, he symbolized the transformative potential of winter's ordeal. The children say old Bergthora saw a one-eyed traveler on the ridge yesterday, seeking shelter before the storm, Freydis mentioned as she returned to her loom. She turned him away, claiming her stores were too low to share. Halldor looked up sharply. Unwise. Very unwise, especially with Yule approaching. Both knew the tales of Odin appearing as a wanderer to test human hospitality, tales that gained particular significance in winter, when refusing shelter could mean death for ordinary travelers. Those who failed this test often faced divine retribution, while those who shared even their meager resources might receive unexpected blessings. Similar beliefs surrounded other gods whose presence was felt strongly during winter. Thor, whose hammer Mjolnir created thunder, was invoked for protection against winter's destructive storms and the frost giants who sent them. Massive Thor stones in fields were left as offerings, often with small bowls carved into them to hold sacrificial blood or ale that would freeze solid. A gift transformed by winter itself into a form the god might appreciate. Ullr, a less prominent deity in the overall pantheon, gained special importance during winter as the god of skiing, hunting, and archery, winter survival skills. Some scholars believe his worship predated that of better-known gods, reflecting his ancient association with winter subsistence. In certain regions, oaths sworn on Uller's ring during winter were considered particularly binding, suggesting his role as witness to human integrity during the challenging season. The goddess Skadi, herself of Jotun, giant ancestry, but married into the Aesir pantheon, personified winter's fierce beauty and the winter skills of skiing and hunting with bow. Her dual nature, part giant, part goddess, reflected the Norse recognition that winter was both adversary and ally, a force to be respected rather than simply feared or resisted. "I'll leave an offering for Skadi on the northern corner post tonight," Freydis decided, selecting a small carved bone amulet from her collection. Her favor might soften the storm's edge. Such household offerings formed part of the daily spiritual practice that intensified during winter. While formal blots were conducted at specific seasonal points by Gothar priests or Jarls chieftains, everyday interactions with the divine were the responsibility of household members, particularly the lady of the house, who served as the family's primary spiritual practitioner. These domestic rituals centered around the hearth, physical and symbolic heart of the home, and the high seat pillars that supported the roof, while connecting the human dwelling to cosmic architecture. Carved with images of gods and equipped with small niches for offerings, these pillars served as conduits between realms, points where prayers might more easily reach divine ears. Beyond the major gods, winter brought increased awareness of various supernatural beings who shared the landscape. Land spirits, Landvatir, required respectful acknowledgement, especially when winter drove humans to exploit marginal resources in their domains. Offerings left at unusual natural features, distinctive rocks, waterfalls, ancient trees, ensured these spirits' cooperation rather than obstruction of winter survival activities. The ancestors, too, drew closer during winter. The Disir, female ancestral spirits who watched over family lines, were believed to be particularly active during winter nights, when they might appear in dreams to offer guidance or warnings. Regular offerings at ancestral memorial stones or cairns maintained these protective relationships, creating spiritual insurance against winter's dangers. Most feared among winter's supernatural denizens were the Draugr, animated corpses of the unquiet dead who gained strength in winter's darkness. Unlike ghosts, these physical revenants could physically attack the living, driven by jealousy of life's warmth. Tales of Draugr breaking into isolated farmsteads during winter storms served as powerful incentives for proper funeral rites and the careful tending of ancestral remains. Finn Thorson claims his father's grave mound was disturbed last night, Haldor mentioned, his tone casual despite the disturbing implication. Footprints in the snow leading away toward the mountains. Freydis made a protective sign. Then we have more than the wild hunt to fear. Barricade the door with the rowan wood posts tonight, not just the regular bar. This exchange highlighted another aspect of Norse winter spirituality, the practical application of mythological knowledge. Specific woods, herbs, runes, and procedures were employed not as empty superstitions, but as technologies for managing supernatural threats, developed through generations of trial and error, in the same way as their physical survival techniques. The most significant manifestation of this practical spirituality came at midwinter with the Yule celebration, a complex religious festival that addressed winter's greatest spiritual danger, the fear that the sun might not return. Though modern people understand the astronomical certainty of the solstice, The Norse experienced the sun's decline as a genuine cosmic crisis, requiring human intervention through ritual. Yule ceremonies operated on multiple levels simultaneously: agricultural magic to ensure future fertility, community bonding to reinforce social cohesion during the difficult months ahead, ancestor veneration to maintain protective relationships, and cosmic participation in the drama of the sun's rebirth. Each element addressed a specific winter challenge, transforming passive endurance into active engagement with the forces that shaped their world. "We must prepare the household for Yule soon," Freydis noted, her hands continuing their steady work at the loom, despite the conversation. "The grain for the special bread should be ground tomorrow, and we need to select which animals will be sacrificed." Halldor nodded, understanding that these preparations were not merely practical but sacred obligations. Proper observance of Yule did more than honor tradition. It helped ensure the cosmic order that supported human existence through winter's darkness. The supernatural landscape of the Norse winter extended beyond gods and spirits to include magical practices that intensified during the dark months. Seidr, a form of shamanic magic primarily practiced by women, gained particular importance as a means of divining the future when planning was most critical and accessing other realms when physical travel was limited. Rune magic offered another avenue for influencing winter conditions. Specific combinations of these ancient symbols might be carved on tools, weapons, or doorposts to invoke protection, ensure successful hunting, prevent illness, or strengthen community bonds. The physical act of carving concentrated intention, while the resulting symbols served as constant reminders of human capacity to shape circumstances rather than merely endure them. "The hunting party should take the marked spears tomorrow," Freydis advised, referring to weapons carved with runic inscriptions for success in the hunt. "And each man should carry Thor's hammer amulet. The forest feels watchful since the storm cleared." This comment reflected the Norse understanding of winter as a time of increased supernatural vigilance, a season when humans moved through a landscape more densely populated with non-human consciousness than during summer's expansive freedom. From the perspective of Norse cosmology, winter's confinement wasn't merely physical but ontological, a compression of human space as other beings claimed greater territory in the world. The Norse response to this spiritual reality was neither simple fear nor dismissive skepticism, but engaged respect, an approach that acknowledged both danger and opportunity in winter's supernatural dimensions. They recognized that winter's harshness came not from divine malice, but from cosmic patterns in which humans, gods, giants, and spirits all played necessary roles. This theological sophistication allowed them to navigate winter not as victims of arbitrary forces, but as participants in meaningful drama. The myths that explained winter, Odin's complex machinations, Thor's battles with frost giants, the binding of Loki, whose eventual breaking would trigger Ragnarok, provided not just stories but templates for understanding their own winter experiences as part of larger patterns. "If the wild hunt rides tonight, it rides with purpose," Freydis observed, glancing toward the barred door where the unnatural silence persisted. "Odin gathers the worthy dead for reasons beyond our knowing. Our task is simply to acknowledge his passage respectfully while continuing our own work." This attitude, recognition of divine agency coupled with human responsibility, characterized the Norse approach to winter spirituality. Unlike traditions that emphasized passive submission to divine will or magical control of supernatural forces, Norse winter religion balanced respect for powers beyond human control with confidence in human capacity to navigate these powers through knowledge, skill, and appropriate ritual. As darkness deepened outside the longhouse, Freydis completed her work at the loom and moved to prepare the evening meal. Despite the heightened supernatural tension she perceived, the rhythm of daily life continued. Another characteristic of Norse winter spirituality, which integrated the extraordinary into ordinary existence, rather than compartmentalizing religious experience. The evening meal itself became a small ritual, with the first portion set aside as an offering, and brief prayers spoken to relevant deities before eating began. Such domestic observances, repeated in households throughout Norse territories, created a fabric of continuous engagement with the divine that intensified during winter's confinement. "Tomorrow, I'll teach the children the old song for calling back the sun," Freydis mentioned as the family gathered around the hearth. "They're old enough now to join in the Yule ceremonies properly." This comment highlighted another aspect of Norse winter spirituality, its intergenerational transmission through active participation rather than formal instruction. Children learned the complex mythology and ritual practices by joining in household and community observances, gradually taking on more significant roles as they matured. The education was holistic, integrating practical skills with spiritual knowledge. Learning to track game in snow involved both physical techniques and understanding of Ullr's domains. Mastering fire-making included both manual dexterity and proper invocations to the flame. Preserving food combined chemical processes with spiritual protection against decay spirits. As the family settled for the night, Halldor secured the door one final time, reinforcing the physical barrier with the rowan wood posts believed to repel Draugr and other malevolent entities. Freydis made a final circuit of the longhouse, checking that protective symbols remained intact and offerings were properly placed. Outside, the unnatural silence finally broke as wind returned, though with a different quality than the storm's rage, a rushing, searching sound that seemed to circle the settlement before moving onward toward the mountains. The dog Freki whimpered once more, then relaxed as the presence passed. "The hunt has moved on," Freydis noted with quiet satisfaction. "We were not its quarry tonight." This simple observation encapsulated much of the Norse approach to winter spirituality: acknowledgement of forces beyond human control, practical precautions based on traditional knowledge, and the quiet satisfaction of having navigated supernatural dangers successfully, not through conquest or denial, but through respect, knowledge, and appropriate action. In this way, the Norse religious response to winter paralleled their practical strategies for physical survival. Just as they neither fought against winter's reality nor passively submitted to it, but rather adapted to its conditions with sophisticated technologies and social structures, so too did they engage winter's spiritual dimensions with a blend of respect, knowledge, and pragmatic ritual that transformed potential terror into meaningful participation in cosmic patterns. Winter, in the Norse worldview, was not merely a season to be endured, but a sacred time when the boundaries between worlds thinned, allowing deeper connection with the divine forces that shaped existence. Their mythology and religious practices didn't deny winter's hardships, but integrated them into a coherent worldview that gave meaning to suffering and purpose to survival. A spiritual technology as sophisticated as their physical adaptations to northern life. The crash of wooden pieces against the carved board echoed through the longhouse as Gunnar Thorkelson studied his opponent's move with narrowed eyes. At 17, Gunnar had developed a reputation for skill at Nefatafl, the King's Table strategy game that occupied many winter evenings throughout Norse settlements. Across from him, his uncle Eric stroked his gray-streaked beard, satisfaction evident in his smile. "Your defense is scattered, nephew," Eric observed. gesturing toward the board where his attacking pieces had pushed through Gunnar's protective formation. Too focused on the western approach, leaving your eastern flank vulnerable. Gunnar grimaced, recognizing the trap too late. Around them, several household members watched with interest, offering occasional commentary or advice, despite the convention that players should make their own decisions. The game represented more than mere entertainment. It taught strategic thinking, reinforced cultural values, and provided a socially acceptable outlet for competitive instincts that might otherwise create tension during winter's forced proximity. Throughout the Norse world, from Iceland to the eastern Baltic, similar scenes played out in longhouses and halls during the long dark months when outdoor activity was limited by cold, snow, and early nightfall. While modern people might imagine Viking winter confinement as a period of grim endurance or enforced idleness, the archaeological and literary evidence reveals a culture that transformed winter's limitations into opportunities for productive, creative, and socially bonding activities. Games formed a central element of this winter culture, with Hnefatafl holding particular importance. Unlike chess, which would later replace it across Scandinavia, Hnefatafl mirrored Norse military realities. An outnumbered defender trying to protect the king against numerically superior attackers. A scenario familiar from both raiding expeditions and home defense. Remember the Battle of Hafrsfjord, Eric advised as Gunnar contemplated his next move. King Harald was surrounded, but found the gap in his opponent's line. There is always a path if you look carefully enough. This casual reference illustrated how games connected to historical and cultural knowledge, with famous battles or legendary encounters often invoked during play. The game itself served as a mnemonic device, helping preserve and transmit accounts of significant events during a time when literacy was limited primarily to runes carved for specific purposes, rather than extended written narratives. Hnefatafl was just one of many board games evidenced in the archaeological record. Excavations have revealed gaming pieces made from wood, bone, antler, stone, glass, and amber, often carved with considerable artistry. Gaming boards have been found etched into wooden planks, stone slabs, and even the thwarts of ships, suggesting their ubiquity in Norse life. My father taught me a different version played in the eastern lands, commented Leif, a trader who had traveled extensively before settling down to marry Gunnar's sister. The king piece has greater movement, but fewer defenders. It makes for a faster game. Such variations reflected the Norse trade networks that, even in winter, connected their culture to a broader world through memory and adaptation. Games traveled along the same routes as material goods, with rules modified to suit local preferences while maintaining core concepts. Dice games provided another popular winter pastime, though with more emphasis on chance than strategy. Made from bone, antler, or wood, dice have been found in numerous archaeological contexts, often in proximity to gaming pieces. Unlike modern cubic dice, Norse versions might have 4 or 5 sides, with different numerical patterns than contemporary equivalents. 3 ships, exclaimed a younger boy, throwing down carved knucklebones in a simpler game played near the hearth. I claim your amber piece. This game of chance taught probability assessment and risk management, valuable skills in a culture where decisions about fishing, raiding, or trading voyages often involved similar calculations of potential gain against possible loss. Physical games adapted for indoor spaces provided essential exercise during confinement. Wrestling matches conducted according to specific rules allowed for physical exertion and skill development without the risk of serious injury that might compromise winter survival. These matches also reinforced the social hierarchy, with successful wrestlers gaining status within the community. Your grip has improved, acknowledged Thorvald, the household's best wrestler, after a brief contest with his son. But remember to use your opponent's weight against them, rather than relying solely on strength. For younger children, winter confinement transformed the longhouse into a play space, with games of chase, hide-and-seek, and imitative play that mimicked adult activities. These games served crucial developmental functions, building physical coordination, social skills, and cultural knowledge through embodied practice rather than formal instruction. "I am Thor," declared a small boy wielding a wooden spoon as a hammer. "And you are the frost giants I must defeat." His playmates enthusiastically assumed their assigned roles as frost giants, scattering before his mock attacks in a game that simultaneously entertained, exercised, and reinforced mythological knowledge central to their cultural identity. Equally important to winter well-being were the various crafts that transformed confinement into productive time. These activities went far beyond mere occupation, representing sophisticated technologies that converted available raw materials into essential tools, clothing, household items, and trade goods. Near the light of the smoke hole, Gunnar's mother Ingrid supervised several younger women engaged in textile production, the most essential and time-consuming winter craft. The process began with wool sorting and cleaning, followed by carding to align fibers, spinning to create thread, and finally weaving or nail binding, a technique similar to crochet, to produce finished goods. "The weft should be tighter on this section," Ingrid advised her daughter, examining the emerging fabric on the upright loom. "Remember that this will be your brother's sea cloak. A loose weave will let the spray through." This instruction highlighted how winter crafts directly contributed to survival. The textile work undertaken during winter confinement would produce the clothing, sails, tents, and other fabric goods essential for success in the more active seasons. Women's winter productivity thus directly enabled the fishing, farming, trading, and raiding that sustained the community throughout the year. The sophisticated nature of Norse textile technology is evidenced in archaeological finds that reveal complex weaving patterns, fine spinning techniques, and the use of multiple natural dyes to create decorative effects. Far from crude homespun, Norse textiles represented highly developed craft requiring extensive knowledge and skill. On the opposite side of the longhouse, woodworking occupied the men's winter hours. Tools were repaired or created, household items replaced, and new equipment prepared for spring activities. The distinctive Norse artistic style, with its intertwined animals, geometric patterns, and mythological references, found expression in even everyday objects, transforming utilitarian items into cultural artifacts. "The grain of the wood determines where you can place the deepest cuts," explained Eric to his youngest son, who was learning to carve decorative elements on a wooden bowl. "Work with the material, rather than forcing it to your will." This philosophy characterized much of Norse craft, a collaboration between human intention and material properties that respected the nature of the substances being transformed. Such an approach reflected their broader relationship with an environment that could neither be entirely controlled nor simply submitted to, but rather engaged with through knowledge, skill, and appropriate tools. Bone and antler carving represented another important winter craft, utilizing materials accumulated during autumn hunting. These durable substances could be transformed into needles, pins, combs, gaming pieces, handles, and decorative items. The slow, careful work was ideally suited to winter evenings, when extended concentration was possible without the competing demands of outdoor activities. "This reindeer antler has the perfect curve for a new netting needle," observed Thorvald, examining a piece he had been soaking to soften slightly before carving. I'll have it ready before the ice fishing begins next week. Metal work continued through winter on a smaller scale than summer's more extensive forging. Delicate work like jewelry making, wire production, or small tool repair could be conducted at the household hearth, while larger projects might wait for communal smithies with better ventilation and higher temperatures. The distinctive Norse metal styles, particularly in silver and bronze work, often incorporated motifs from mythology and nature, reflecting their integrated worldview. "Add more horn to the flux," advised an older man watching his grandson attempt to solder a broken brooch. "It will flow more smoothly around the join." Such specific technical knowledge was transmitted primarily through direct demonstration and supervised practice rather than formal instruction. Winter's confinement created the extended contact between generations necessary for this type of learning, allowing skills developed over centuries to pass from experienced practitioners to novices. Leatherworking represented yet another essential winter craft, transforming hides acquired during autumn hunting and slaughter into clothing, containers, and equipment components. The process involved multiple stages: initial cleaning and scraping, tanning with solutions made from bark or brains, stretching to the desired thickness and suppleness, cutting to pattern, and finally stitching or lacing into finished items. "This sealskin will make excellent waterproof boots," noted a woman working near the door, where ventilation mitigated the strong smell of the tanning process, but only if we give it enough time in the solution before stitching. The patience required for proper craft production aligned well with winter's extended time frame. Unlike the compressed urgency of summer activities, winter work could unfold at an appropriate pace, allowing for precision, experimentation, and the transmission of nuanced techniques that might be abbreviated when time pressured. Storytelling, song, and music accompanied these winter crafts, creating a multi-sensory environment that mitigated the potential monotony of confinement. The rhythmic nature of many craft activities, the swing of the loom beater, the stroke of carving tools, the turn of the spindle, created natural opportunities for accompaniment that enhanced both the craft process and the musical experience. "Sing the boat-building song again," requested one of the younger woodworkers, his hands continuing their steady carving as another man began the familiar tune that mimicked the rhythm of adze strikes against timber. Soon others joined in, the melody connecting their current indoor work to memories of communal shipbuilding from more expansive seasons. This integration of practical work with cultural expression characterized the Norse approach to winter confinement. Rather than separating utility from beauty or necessity from meaning, their winter crafts simultaneously addressed physical needs and cultural continuity, creating objects that were both useful and symbolically significant. The social dimension of these winter activities cannot be overstated. Most crafts involved cooperation between multiple people, creating natural opportunities for conversation, knowledge sharing, relationship building, and conflict resolution. The physical arrangement of the longhouse, with its central hearth and communal work areas, reinforced this social aspect, making winter craft production a community experience rather than isolated labor. "Pass me the blue thread," requested a woman working on an elaborate tablet-woven band that would eventually decorate a ceremonial garment. "And tell me again about how your grandmother created that modified pattern with the interlocking triangles." Such conversations embedded technical knowledge within social relationships, connecting craft techniques to family histories and community identities. The resulting objects carried not only practical utility, but social significance, visible reminders of the connections between people, skills, and materials that sustained Norse life through winter and beyond. Innovation emerged naturally from this environment of concentrated craft activity. The extended focus made possible by winter confinement, combined with the exchange of techniques between practitioners and occasional introduction of external influences through trade or travel, created conditions where traditional methods could be refined or adapted to new purposes. I've modified the traditional pattern to include elements from what I saw in Dublin last trading season, explained Leaf, showing a wood carving that blended Norse and Celtic motifs. The spiral technique they use creates more depth in the image. This openness to adaptation characterized Norse material culture throughout its history. Despite strong traditions, their crafts evolved continuously through winter seasons of experimentation and refinement, allowing their material culture to respond to changing conditions while maintaining distinctive Norse aesthetics and functions. As evening deepened in the longhouse, the various craft activities began to wind down. Completed items were stored carefully, works in progress set aside in anticipation of tomorrow's continuation. The Nefatufel game between Gunnar and Eric had concluded with the uncle's victory, though the nephew had fought skillfully enough to earn genuine praise rather than mere consolation. Next time, I'll consider my eastern flank more carefully, Gunnar acknowledged, helping to store the carefully carved game pieces in their leather pouch. Though I still think your third move was more luck than strategy. Eric laughed, accepting the good-natured challenge embedded in his nephew's comment. Perhaps we'll play again tomorrow and test that theory. But for now, I believe your mother has finished the evening's storytelling preparations. The transition from crafts and games to storytelling represented the culmination of the winter day, the movement from productive activity to cultural reinforcement that completed the cycle of Norse winter life. As the household gathered around the hearth, their hands might finally rest, but their minds remained engaged in the collective experience that bound them together through winter's challenge. Through their games and crafts, the Norse transformed winter confinement from a period of deprivation into one of creation. The objects produced, from clothing to tools, vessels to decorations, represented not merely survival necessities, but expressions of cultural identity and continuity. The skills developed and refined during these winter activities enabled the community's continued adaptation to their challenging environment, while the social bonds strengthened through shared work created the human foundation for collective survival. Winter, in the Norse experience, was not merely endured but utilized. Its limitations embraced as opportunities for focused production, skill development, and cultural expression that would have been impossible during the expansive but demanding seasons of external activity. The games and crafts that filled their winter days and evenings represented not desperate occupation in the face of boredom, but sophisticated cultural technologies that transformed confinement into creation, limitation into opportunity, and individual skill into collective strength. The argument had been simmering since midday, growing steadily more heated as the short winter daylight faded. Now, in the smoky dimness of the longhouse, it threatened to erupt into violence as two men faced each other with hands clenched and faces flushed with anger. "You've moved the boundary stones," accused Hakan, a burly farmer in his fourth decade. "3 paces into my land, while the snow covered the markers." "False," retorted Gunnar, his neighbor of 15 years. "The stones stand where they've always been. Your memory is as frozen as the fjord if you claim otherwise." Around them, the household had grown silent, ordinary activities suspended as the confrontation reached its critical point. Children were quietly moved to the far end of the structure, while adults positioned themselves to intervene if necessary. In the close confines of winter quarters, violence could spread rapidly, endangering not just the immediate participants, but the entire community. Before either man could advance toward the other, a commanding voice cut through the tension. "Enough," declared Thorbjorn Lawspeaker, rising from his seat near the central hearth. Though in his 7th decade, the old man's authority was immediately apparent, as both disputants turned toward him. "This matter will be addressed properly, according to law and custom. We are not beasts to tear at each other when disagreements arise." This intervention illustrated one of the most sophisticated aspects of Norse winter adaptation: their development of formal and informal governance systems, specifically designed to maintain order during the intense social pressure of winter confinement. While summer disputes might be diffused by physical separation or addressed at regular things, assemblies held outdoors during good weather, winter required more immediate and contained methods of conflict resolution. Thorbjorn gestured toward the high seat where the household's patriarch normally presided. "Sigurd, as householder, will you hear this case, or shall I act as arbitrator?" Sigurd, a respected farmer who headed the extended family, considered briefly. "I ask you to judge, Thorbjorn. You have no kinship with either party and know the law better than any here." With a nod, Thorbjorn indicated a bench near the fire. "Sit, both of you. Separate ends of the bench. We will address this matter with words, not fists." The formality of this process, even in a relatively modest household rather than a chieftain's hall, demonstrated the Norse understanding that winter governance required clear procedures that everyone recognized as legitimate. Without the physical space to separate conflicting parties or the ability to easily convene larger community assemblies during winter storms, they relied on procedural justice that could function within confined quarters. As the two disputants reluctantly seated themselves, Thorbjorn established the framework for the proceedings. Each will speak in turn, without interruption. Hakon first, as he brought the complaint. Then Gunnar will respond. Witnesses may be called if needed. I will then pronounce judgment according to the law of our ancestors and the customs of this region. This structured approach to conflict resolution reflected broader patterns of Norse governance that adapted to winter's particular challenges. While the Vikings are often portrayed in popular culture as lawless raiders, historical and archaeological evidence reveals a society deeply concerned with legal process and social order. Concerns that intensified during winter, when community survival depended on maintaining functional relationships despite proximity stresses. The most formal level of Norse winter governance occurred at the Winter Things, assemblies held at designated locations during specific times of the winter season. Unlike the more comprehensive Althing of summer, which might address major cases and legislative matters, Winter Things typically focused on immediate community concerns: resource allocation, dispute resolution, and enforcement of winter-specific regulations. "I remind you both," Thorbjorn continued, "that the winter law passed at Michaelmas forbids any physical alteration of property boundaries until the spring inspection. This is for the very reason we see here. Snow can obscure markers and lead to disputes." This reference to seasonal legislation highlighted another aspect of Norse winter governance: the creation of specific rules for winter conditions that might differ from summer practices. Understanding that different seasons required different social agreements, Norse communities established dual legal frameworks that could be applied as conditions warranted. As Hakon presented his case, carefully detailing his claim, that the boundary stones had been moved during heavy snow that would hide footprints, the household members listened attentively. Winter dispute resolution was rarely a private matter. Confined communities recognized that everyone had a stake in peaceful outcomes, making conflict resolution a collective concern rather than merely an issue between the immediate parties. 3 witnesses saw the stones before the heavy snow last month, Hakan concluded. They will confirm my description of their placement. When Gunnar's turn came, he presented an alternative explanation, suggesting that the previous summer's unusually heavy rains had washed soil from around the stones, making them appear to have shifted position, when in fact they remained where they had been placed a generation earlier, when the land was divided between their respective fathers. The stream that marks our western boundary overflowed its banks twice, he noted. Ask any who helped clear the damage afterward. The careful attention to evidence, the structured presentation of competing narratives, and the reliance on witness testimony all reflected a governance system built on procedural rather than arbitrary authority. Even in settings far from formal courts, Norse winter dispute resolution followed patterns designed to create legitimacy through process rather than mere power. After hearing both accounts and questioning several witnesses who had knowledge of the situation, Thorbjorn deliberated briefly before rendering his decision. Neither party has proven their case with certainty, he declared. And in such cases, our law provides a clear remedy. When spring allows proper examination, 3 neutral witnesses chosen by the community will inspect the boundary and determine if movement has occurred. Until then, both parties will respect the boundary as it currently stands, with neither making any claim or taking any action regarding the disputed area. This solution, practical, temporary, and focused on maintaining peace until better conditions allowed for definitive resolution, typified Norse approaches to winter governance. Rather than forcing absolute judgments in suboptimal circumstances, their legal traditions included provisional measures designed specifically for winter conditions. Do you both accept this judgment? Thorbjorn asked formally. After both men grudgingly nodded their assent, he added, "Then you will now grasp hands as kinsmen should, and share a drink to confirm your acceptance of the judgment. Winter is long, and neither household can afford ongoing enmity." This ritualized reconciliation represented another element of Norse winter governance, the recognition that social harmony was not merely desirable, but essential for survival. Unresolved conflicts in confined spaces created tensions that could undermine cooperation on critical tasks or erupt into violence that threatened the entire household. Throughout the Norse world, similar scenes played out in longhouses and halls of all sizes during the winter months. From the humblest family farm to the grandest jarl's residence, winter created governance challenges that required sophisticated social technologies to address. The specific mechanisms might vary by region and social class, but the underlying principles remained consistent. Clear procedures, community involvement, provisional solutions when necessary, and ritualized reconciliation. In larger settlements and halls, winter governance often featured formal roles assigned to specific individuals. The hardmen in a chieftain's retinue might serve as peacekeepers during winter feasts when alcohol and proximity could spark conflicts. Designated arbitrators with reputations for fairness and knowledge of precedent might travel between settlements during brief, clear weather to resolve disputes that local authorities couldn't settle. Last winter, we had to bring in Thorald from across the fjord to settle the inheritance dispute between the Eriksson brothers, recalled Sigurd after the immediate conflict had been diffused. 3 days of blizzard, We waited for the weather to clear enough for the messenger to reach him. This comment highlighted another challenge of winter governance: the difficulty of accessing higher authorities or neutral parties when weather-constrained travel. Norse communities addressed this through a nested system of authority that provided multiple levels of conflict resolution, from immediate household intervention to community elders to regional figures of respect, with cases escalated only when necessary. The physical arrangement of winter quarters often incorporated governance considerations. High seat pillars, the ornately carved posts that flanked the household leader's seat, served as visible reminders of authority and often featured images of gods associated with justice and order. The central hearth provided not just warmth but a communal space where disputes could be addressed with the entire household as witness, creating transparency that discouraged arbitrary judgments. Winter governance extended beyond formal dispute resolution to include the management of daily activities that required coordination in confined spaces. Household leaders established schedules for tasks requiring the central hearth, allocated sleeping spaces to minimize conflicts, and regulated activities that might create tension in close quarters. The wood carving will move to the eastern end today, Sigurd announced at the morning meal. The dust was bothering those weaving near the hearth yesterday. Such mundane coordination represented a critical aspect of winter governance that prevented minor irritations from developing into serious conflicts. By establishing clear expectations and addressing potential friction points proactively, household leaders maintained an environment where the intense proximity of winter living remained manageable. Resource management formed another crucial aspect of winter governance. While summer allowed for more individual autonomy in food procurement, winter necessitated careful collective management of stored supplies that needed to last until spring. Household leaders oversaw distribution, ensuring fairness while maintaining reserves for emergencies or unexpected extension of winter conditions. The dried fish is being consumed too quickly, Sigurd noted after consulting with his wife, who managed the household stores. From tomorrow, each person's portion will be reduced by 1/4. We must ensure supplies last until the spring fishing. This type of resource regulation, transparent, explained, and applied equally, exemplified effective winter governance. Rather than arbitrary rationing, Norse households typically managed winter resources through clear systems understood by all members, creating predictability that reduced anxiety about survival. The governance of external relationships also adapted to winter conditions. While summer might bring frequent visitors, trading opportunities, and social exchanges between settlements, winter isolation required different approaches to maintaining necessary connections while managing the risks of extending hospitality during resource-constrained periods. The travelers who arrived yesterday may stay 3 nights as custom allows, Sigurd informed the household. They have contributed dried meat to our stores in exchange for shelter and bring news from the southern settlements that concerns us all. This balanced approach to winter hospitality, offering necessary shelter while establishing clear expectations regarding duration and contribution, represented another governance adaptation to winter conditions. By formalizing what might be more casual arrangements during summer abundance, Norse communities maintained essential connections without endangering their own survival. Winter governance also addressed the psychological dimensions of confinement. Recognizing that prolonged proximity and limited space created unique stresses, household and community leaders implemented practices designed to manage tension and maintain mental well-being alongside physical survival. Tonight we will have music and tales, Sigurd announced after the boundary dispute had been resolved. Bjorn will play the harp, and Thorbjorn has promised the story of Thor's journey to Utgard Loki that the children have requested. These structured entertainments served not merely as diversions, but as governance tools that redirected attention from potential conflicts towards shared experiences that reinforced community bonds. The timing was rarely accidental. Experienced leaders recognized tension patterns and intervened with collective activities before conflicts could develop. Religious and spiritual practices formed another component of winter governance. Household blots, sacrifices, and offerings to gods associated with harmony and good order created shared spiritual experiences that transcended individual grievances. Ancestral veneration reminded community members of their connections beyond immediate disputes, placing current conflicts in the perspective of generational continuity. Before the evening meal, we will make offerings to Forseti, the god of justice and reconciliation, Sigurd declared. Each household member will participate, regardless of today's disagreements. This integration of spiritual practice with social governance reflected the Norse understanding that winter challenges required responses addressing both physical circumstances and psychological needs. By embedding conflict resolution within religious frameworks, they created additional legitimacy for judgments and additional motivation for reconciliation. As the evening progressed in Sigurd's household, the earlier tension between Hakon and Gunnar gradually dissipated. Though neither had fully abandoned his position, the formal resolution process had created a structure within which they could coexist without immediate conflict. By the time the promised storytelling began, they sat on the same bench, albeit at opposite ends, both engaged in the communal experience. This outcome, not perfect harmony, but functional peace, represented the realistic goal of Norse winter governance. Understanding that the stresses of confinement inevitably created friction, their governance systems aimed not to eliminate conflict entirely, but to manage it within boundaries that protected community function and individual safety. The sophistication of these governance adaptations challenges simplistic representations of Viking society as merely hierarchical or violence-based. While hierarchy certainly existed and violence remained an option, winter survival demanded more nuanced social technologies. Systems of procedural justice, resource management, conflict de-escalation, and psychological support that created sustainable social environments despite physical confinement. As darkness settled fully outside the longhouse and the storytelling reached its conclusion, the household prepared for sleep. The boundary dispute that had threatened to erupt into violence hours earlier had been transformed through governance processes into a manageable disagreement to be fully resolved in spring. Winter would bring other conflicts. Proximity guaranteed that. But the social technologies developed through generations of northern adaptation stood ready to address them. In their governance, as in their material adaptations, the Norse approach to winter demonstrated their characteristic pragmatism, ingenuity, and balance between individual and collective needs. Rather than allowing winter's physical challenges to undermine social cohesion, they developed governance systems specifically designed for confined conditions, creating order not through escape from winter's reality, but through direct engagement with its particular demands. As the winter storm intensified outside, 3 generations of the Eriksson family gathered around the central hearth of their longhouse. Frida Eriksdottir, at 73 winters, sat nearest the fire, her gnarled hands continuing to spin wool despite eyes that could no longer clearly see the thread. Her son Ulf and his wife Astrid occupied the high seat, overseeing the evening meal preparation. Their children, grandchildren, and 2 unmarried siblings completed the household of 17 souls, sheltering together against the winter's assault. "Tell us again about the winter of 3 moons, requested Eric, Ulf's 12-year-old son, addressing his grandmother. "When your family was trapped by snow until spring." Frida's hands never ceased their spinning as she began the familiar tale of a winter from her childhood when unprecedented snowfall had isolated her family's farmstead for months. The story, told and retold each winter, contained practical survival knowledge embedded within family history, a characteristic blend of instruction and identity that typified Norse approaches to kinship. For Viking-age Scandinavians, the family unit represented the most fundamental survival strategy for winter's challenges. Beyond mere emotional bonds, kinship created practical systems of mutual support, knowledge transmission, resource sharing, labor specialization, and physical protection that made winter survival possible. The composition and function of these family units revealed sophisticated adaptation to northern conditions, far beyond simple household arrangements. The typical Norse winter household extended well beyond the nuclear family to include multiple generations, unmarried siblings, occasionally more distant relatives, and sometimes non-kin members like servants or thralls. This extended family structure created numerous advantages for winter survival. Diverse skill sets, built-in redundancy for essential tasks, efficient resource utilization, and the ability to care for members temporarily or permanently unable to contribute at full capacity. Astrid, show Ingrid how to render the fat properly, Ulf directed, nodding toward his daughter and wife. She needs to master this before she joins her husband's household next summer. This casual instruction illustrated one of the extended family's most crucial winter functions: the transmission of essential knowledge between generations. While summer activities often separated family members according to task, men fishing or hunting at a distance, while women managed activities closer to home, winter confinement created extended contact between generations that facilitated the detailed teaching of survival skills. Young children learned through observation and graduated participation, moving from simple tasks to more complex responsibilities as they demonstrated readiness. Adolescents received focused instruction in gender-specific skills they would need to establish their own households, with winter providing the concentrated teaching time that busy summer months couldn't afford. Even adults continued learning specialized techniques from elders whose decades of experience had refined their knowledge of particular crafts or practices. The physical arrangement of the winter dwelling reflected and reinforced these kinship structures. Sleeping platforms around the perimeter of the longhouse were assigned according to family relationships and status, with the household leaders typically occupying a position of honor near the center. Married couples might have slightly separated sleeping spaces, often marked by simple wooden partitions, while unmarried individuals generally shared sleeping areas with others of similar age and gender. "The northern bench leaks cold air," Frida noted. "The youngest should sleep in the southern section tonight." This simple suggestion demonstrated another aspect of kinship function: the continuous adjustment of arrangements to protect the most vulnerable family members. Young children and the elderly, most susceptible to cold-related illness, were positioned in the warmest locations. Those in robust health took the colder spots near doors or walls. This fluid arrangement, adjusted according to conditions and need, rather than rigid assignment, exemplified the practical flexibility of Norse kinship in winter settings. Resource sharing within the family unit followed similar principles of practical necessity rather than abstract equality. Food was distributed according to a combination of need and contribution, with heavy physical laborers receiving larger portions than those engaged in less calorie-intensive work, but with careful attention to maintaining adequate nutrition for all household members, regardless of productive capacity. Give more of the meat to the men who cleared snow from the roof today, Astrid instructed as the evening meal was served. But ensure grandmother has the broth with herbs for her cough. This nuanced approach to resource distribution, neither strictly egalitarian nor rigidly hierarchical, created sustainable systems for winter survival. By acknowledging differential needs while ensuring basic welfare for all members, Norse families maintained both productive capacity and group cohesion through winter's challenges. Labor specialization within the family created efficient systems for managing winter tasks. While all members contributed according to ability, individuals developed particular expertise in specific areas. One might excel at carving tools, another at textile production, a third at food preservation techniques. This specialization allowed the family unit to maintain the diverse skill set necessary for comprehensive winter survival, while developing high-level expertise in each crucial area. Ask Thorvald to check the fishing spears, Ulf suggested when an ice fishing expedition was proposed. His eye for weak points in the bindings has saved many catches. Gender formed one axis of this labor specialization, with Norse winter households typically assigning different task domains to men and women. Men generally managed outdoor winter activities like hunting, ice fishing, and timber harvesting, along with indoor crafts involving wood, bone, and metal. Women controlled food storage and preparation, textile production, dairy processing, and medicinal knowledge. However, these divisions showed more flexibility than rigid separation, with individuals crossing gender boundaries when necessity or talent warranted. Bjorn has the best hand for delicate stitching, Astrid acknowledged, referring to her brother-in-law, who often assisted with fine textile work despite it being typically women's domain. Have him finish the embroidery on the ceremonial cloak. Age provided another organizational principle within family labor systems. Children gradually assumed more responsibility as they matured, beginning with simple tasks that both contributed to household function and developed essential skills. Elders whose physical strength had diminished shifted to advisory roles and specialized crafts that required expertise rather than strength, ensuring they remained valued contributors despite changing capabilities. I can no longer set the heavy fishing nets, acknowledged Eric, Ulf's elderly father. But my eyes still find the weak spots in the weaving that younger hands can repair. This integration of all family members into productive roles, regardless of age or physical condition, created resilient winter households that maximized human resources while maintaining the dignity and purpose of each individual. Rather than viewing young children or the elderly as burdens, Norse winter adaptation incorporated them into functional roles that benefited from their particular capabilities while accommodating their limitations. The emotional dimension of kinship provided another crucial element of winter survival strategy. Extended confinement in close quarters created psychological stresses that family bonds helped mitigate. Shared identity, mutual history, and established relationship patterns provided stability amid winter's uncertainties. The stories, songs, and celebrations that punctuated winter evenings reinforced these connections, creating psychological resilience alongside material security. Remember the winter after the Great Raid, when father returned with barely enough strength to walk? Ulf's brother Torsten reminisced during the evening storytelling. Mother nursed him back while you and I managed the hunting, though we were barely men ourselves. Such shared memories, recounted and elaborated through winter's long evenings, strengthened family cohesion while transmitting values and expectations to younger generations. These narratives illustrated key family virtues: perseverance, cooperation, sacrifice for kin, while establishing continuity between past challenges and present circumstances. Conflict management within the family represented another sophisticated aspect of Norse winter adaptation. Understanding that proximity inevitably generated friction, families developed mechanisms for addressing tensions before they threatened household function. Clear authority structures, typically centered on the senior married couple, provided frameworks for resolving disputes. Designated spaces within the dwelling allowed for temporary separation when emotions ran high, while structured activities redirected energy from potential conflicts toward productive outcomes. Enough of this bickering over the game pieces. Astrid intervened as two adolescent cousins argued with increasing heat. Sven, help your grandfather repair the fishing net. Leif, the woodpile needs stacking. You'll return to the game when both tasks are complete and tempers have cooled. This practical approach to conflict, neither ignoring tensions nor allowing them to escalate, but channeling emotion into productive activity, characterized effective Norse family governance during winter confinement. The authority to direct such interventions typically resided with the household leaders, whose responsibility included maintaining the social harmony essential for collective survival. The family unit also managed external relationships during winter's isolation. Kinship networks extended beyond individual households, creating systems of mutual obligation and support between related families, even when separated by distance. When weather permitted travel, these connections facilitated resource sharing, information exchange, and assistance during crises. During periods of complete isolation, the knowledge that kin would attempt aid when possible provided psychological security even when physical help remained temporarily inaccessible. If the storm clears tomorrow, send Torsten to check on your sister's family across the valley, Ulf instructed his eldest son. Their roof was damaged in the autumn, and this heavy snow may have caused problems. These inter-household kinship obligations created resilience at the community level, distributing risk and resources across a network of related families. If one household faced particular hardship, a damaged dwelling, illness among key members, or localized resource failure, kin obligations would prompt assistance from related households, preventing single-point failures from becoming community-wide disasters. Marriage arrangements considered winter survival implications alongside other factors. Unions created strategic alliances between families, expanding resource access and support networks. Winter often served as the time when such arrangements were negotiated, with prospective in-laws evaluating not just the individual potential spouse, but the winter competence of their entire family unit, whose practices and resources would now become partially shared through the new connection. The Thorvaldsen family manages their winter stores with exceptional care, noted Astrid, as the household discussed a potential match for their daughter. Their techniques for preserving cloudberries lasted until spring thaw last year, when our own supplies had long been exhausted. Such practical considerations were integrated with personal compatibility, religious considerations, and economic factors to create marriage alliances that strengthened winter resilience. Once established, these connections created obligations of mutual assistance that either family could activate during winter hardship, expanding the support network available in emergencies. The extended Norse kinship system also provided crucial support for community members without immediate family due to death, disaster, or other circumstances. Obligations toward more distant relatives, ensured that few individuals faced winter entirely alone. Widowed, orphaned, or otherwise isolated individuals were typically incorporated into related households, where they assumed appropriate roles according to age, gender, and ability. Halfdan will join our household this winter, Ulf announced before the first snow. With his brother's death and his arm still healing poorly from the summer accident, he cannot manage alone. He brings his skill with leather working and his share of the autumn hunt. This incorporation of non-immediate family members based on kinship obligation created social insurance against winter isolation, ensuring that even those who had lost their primary family support still had access to the protection of a functioning household. The reciprocal nature of these arrangements, with the incorporated individual contributing according to ability rather than entering as a passive dependent, maintained dignity while addressing practical needs. As the evening in the Eriksson household progressed toward sleep arrangements, the various dimensions of kinship as survival strategy became increasingly visible. The eldest took the warmest sleeping spots nearest the banked fire that would burn slowly through the night. Younger adults assumed responsibility for final security checks of doors and critical supplies. Children were settled with familiar rituals that provided psychological comfort amid the storm's continuing howl. Sleep well, Frida blessed her grandchildren and great-grandchildren as they arranged their sleeping furs. The family surrounds you, as it has through hundreds of winters before you were born. This simple statement encapsulated the Norse understanding of kinship as transcending individual lives to create continuity across generations. The family unit represented not merely current relationships, but a link between ancestors and descendants, a continuous chain of knowledge, practice, and identity that extended beyond any single winter to encompass the entire human relationship with northern seasonality. In their sophisticated development of kinship as winter survival strategy, the Norse demonstrated their characteristic pragmatism and adaptive intelligence. Rather than imposing abstract social ideals onto winter's reality, they evolved family structures specifically suited to the season's challenges. Extended units that maximized resource efficiency, knowledge transmission, labor specialization, and psychological support while minimizing the vulnerabilities that isolated individuals or nuclear families might face in northern conditions. The resulting kinship systems exhibited both structure and flexibility, clear role differentiation and adaptive capacity, individual specialization and collective identity. These balanced qualities created winter households capable of weathering not just the physical challenges of cold and scarcity, but the social and psychological stresses of extended confinement, transforming potentially vulnerable human groups into resilient, winter-adapted communities, bound by blood, practice, and shared survival through the dark months. The coughing from the corner of the longhouse had grown worse through the night. Old Marta, approaching her 8th decade, struggled for breath in the smoky air as her daughter Ingrid wiped her brow with a cloth dampened in melted snow. Around them, the household continued its morning activities with practiced efficiency, though concerned glances were frequently directed toward the sick woman's bed. "The herb mixture isn't helping," Ingrid reported quietly to Thorvald, the household's leader and her brother. "Her fever rises despite the willow bark tea." Thorvald nodded gravely, the lines in his weather-beaten face deepening with concern. At 53, he had seen enough winter illnesses to recognize the seriousness of their mother's condition. Winter sickness represented one of the season's most dreaded dangers, capable of spreading rapidly through confined households while simultaneously depleting the strength of essential workers and threatening the most vulnerable community members. Send Eric to Gudrun's dwelling, he decided after brief consideration. She has stronger remedies and more experience with lung ailments than anyone in our settlement. This decision, to seek specialized assistance for a vulnerable family member, despite difficult travel conditions, illustrated one aspect of Norse approaches to winter community care. Rather than viewing vulnerability as an individual or familial burden to be borne in isolation, Norse communities developed sophisticated systems for collective support during crisis periods, when the gap between the strong and vulnerable became most consequential. The Norse understanding of vulnerability was nuanced rather than binary. They recognized that winter conditions created various forms of vulnerability that might affect different community members at different times. The physical vulnerability of the very young and very old to cold and illness. The resource vulnerability of households that had experienced poor harvests or lost critical members. The psychological vulnerability that extended darkness and confinement could produce in otherwise robust individuals. And the social vulnerability of those with limited kin networks or community standing. While you wait for Gudrun, move Mother's bed closer to the hearth, but away from the main draft path, Thorvald instructed his sister, and have the children gather more of the pine resin that clears breathing when burned. Ascot will help them find the right trees. These practical responses to immediate vulnerability demonstrated the integrated nature of Norse community care, drawing on environmental knowledge, social resources, and household organization to address specific needs as they arose. Rather than relying on specialized institutions or designated caregivers, their approach distributed responsibility throughout the community according to capability and relationship. When young Eric returned several hours later with Gudrun, the household rearranged itself to accommodate her examination and treatment of the sick woman. Though not formally designated as a healer, Gudrun's reputation rested on generations of practical experience with winter ailments, knowledge passed from mother to daughter, and refined through careful observation of results. She needs stronger steam to clear her lungs, Gudrun pronounced after listening to Marta's breathing. Heat stones in the fire, then place them in a container with these herbs and water. Create a tent with woolen cloth over her so she breathes only the steam for short periods. This methodology, practical, experience-based, and utilizing available materials, typified Norse approaches to healing. Rather than theoretical medicine, they relied on accumulated empirical knowledge of what had proven effective through generations of winter trials. The transmission of this knowledge, primarily through women's networks, created community resources that could be activated when vulnerability manifested as illness. Also prepare this tea, Gudrun continued, providing dried herbs from her own stored supply. It strengthens the body's battle against winter sickness. All in the household should drink it daily as protection, with double portions for the oldest and youngest. This preventative approach highlighted another aspect of Norse community care, the recognition that vulnerability existed on a spectrum requiring different interventions at different points. Preventative measures for those not yet ill, supportive care for the mildly affected, and intensive treatment for the seriously ill created a comprehensive system that addressed vulnerability at all stages, rather than waiting for crisis. The Norse approach to winter vulnerability extended well beyond medical response to illness. Community systems developed to address various forms of weakness or need that winter conditions might expose or exacerbate. Food sharing represented one of the most essential of these systems, with clear cultural expectations regarding support for households experiencing shortage. "Take this preserved meat to Widow Thyra's dwelling," Thorvald instructed his son later that day, setting aside a significant portion from the family's winter stores. Her son's hunting accident before the first snow means their stores will be depleted by now. Such redistribution wasn't presented as charity, but as mutual insurance, a recognition that any household might face circumstances beyond their control that depleted critical resources. The expectation of reciprocity, if not in the current winter, then in future seasons when fortunes might reverse, created sustainable support systems that addressed immediate vulnerability while maintaining the dignity of all participants. Labor sharing provided another crucial support system during the winter crisis. When illness, injury, or death depleted a household's working capacity, community members would temporarily assume essential tasks to prevent cascading failures that might threaten survival. "Our men will clear her roof before the next snowfall," Thorvald decided, referring to the widow's dwelling, "and check her woodpile. With her son injured, those tasks may be beyond her household's capacity." This practical assistance targeted specific vulnerabilities created by the loss of adult male labor in a household otherwise capable of self-maintenance. Rather than complete dependency, such support addressed particular gaps while allowing the affected household to maintain function in areas where their capacity remained intact. A balanced approach that prevented vulnerability in one domain from creating total dependency. The Norse approach to winter vulnerability acknowledged that emotional and psychological support was as essential as material assistance. Social inclusion of potentially isolated individuals, particularly the elderly, widowed, or disabled, represented a conscious community strategy rather than mere compassion. "Invite Thyra and her household to tomorrow's storytelling," Thorvald suggested to his wife. "The boy's spirit needs lifting as much as his body needs healing, and his mother could use the company of other women after so many days of isolated caregiving." This social dimension of community care recognized that winter vulnerability included isolation, despair, and loss of purpose, alongside material deprivation. By maintaining meaningful inclusion and role dignity for vulnerable members, Norse communities addressed the full spectrum of winter challenges, rather than merely ensuring physical survival. Special attention was paid to the community's oldest and youngest members during winter. Children represented both future potential and immediate vulnerability, with their smaller bodies more susceptible to cold and their developing immune systems more vulnerable to winter illness. The elderly embodied accumulated knowledge essential for community adaptation, while facing physical frailties that winter conditions exacerbated. "The children and elders will remain inside tomorrow," Thorvald announced, noting the bitter cold settling in as darkness fell. "Those in full strength will handle the outdoor tasks regardless of normal assignments." This flexible reallocation of labor according to capability, rather than rigid role assignment, characterized effective Norse responses to extreme conditions. When winter intensity peaked, communities redistributed tasks to protect vulnerable members while maintaining essential functions, a pragmatic approach that prioritized collective survival over individual role consistency. The Norse response to disability, whether temporary or permanent, congenital or acquired, demonstrated similar pragmatism and inclusion. Rather than viewing disabled individuals as burdens, communities integrated them into productive roles adapted to their specific capabilities, recognizing that few impairments affected all possible contributions to household function. "Halvar cannot walk since his fall from the cliff," Gudrun noted while gathering her medicines after treating Marta. but his carving skill exceeds any other in the settlement. My knife handle broke last week, and he created a replacement better than the original. This focus on capability, rather than limitation, allowed communities to benefit from the contributions of all members, regardless of physical condition. An approach particularly valuable during winter, when maximum utilization of human resources became essential for collective survival. By maintaining productive roles for differently abled individuals, Norse communities simultaneously addressed material needs and preserved the dignity that came with meaningful contribution. Children with congenital conditions that might be considered disabilities in modern contexts were similarly integrated into household and community function according to their particular capabilities. Rather than measuring against an abstract standard of normal development, Norse communities assessed each child's potential contributions and developed their skills accordingly. Young Finn cannot speak clearly, Gudrun observed, but his eyesight surpasses anyone I've known. He spotted the herd of deer last hunting expedition when no one else could see through the snow glare. This practical valuation of diverse abilities created space for meaningful inclusion of individuals who might otherwise be marginalized, transforming potential vulnerability into specialized contribution. The confined conditions of winter, rather than exacerbating exclusion, often highlighted the value of diverse capabilities when every contribution affected collective survival. For those whose vulnerability stemmed from social rather than physical factors, individuals with limited kin connections or damaged reputation, winter community care operated through more formalized systems. The H-Repper, a mutual insurance association found particularly in Iceland, created obligatory support mechanisms for community members experiencing critical need, regardless of their social standing or personal connections. The Thing Council has assessed an additional contribution from each household with surplus, Thorvald informed his family after returning from a community meeting held during a break in the weather. 2 households lost their stores in the fire last week, and all must help if they are to survive until spring. This institutionalized support mechanism represented a sophisticated response to the reality that winter vulnerability could strike even previously secure households through sudden disaster. By creating community-wide obligation rather than relying solely on voluntary assistance, such systems ensured that vulnerability resulting from misfortune didn't lead to preventable tragedy. The Norse approach to winter vulnerability balanced pragmatism with compassion, individual responsibility with collective insurance, and immediate crisis response with sustainable long-term solutions. Rather than idealizing either complete self-sufficiency or unlimited support, they developed nuanced systems that recognized the reality of human interdependence during challenging conditions while maintaining the dignity and agency of all community members. As evening settled over the longhouse, Marta's condition showed slight improvement. The steam treatment had eased her breathing somewhat, and Gudrun's herbal tea had reduced her fever. Around her bed, family members maintained regular activities while incorporating her care into their routine. Younger children assigned to keep her water cup filled, older family members taking turns sitting with her during the night. "We'll maintain the treatments through the night," Gudrun instructed before returning to her own dwelling. "Send for me immediately if her breathing worsens, regardless of the hour or weather." This commitment to prioritize care despite personal inconvenience or environmental challenges embodied the Norse understanding that community survival depended on addressing vulnerability wherever it appeared. Winter demanded strength, certainly, but also revealed the limitations of individual self-sufficiency. creating conditions where mutual support became not merely compassionate, but essential for collective survival. Throughout the Norse world, similar scenes played out in countless households during winter's grip. The specific vulnerabilities might differ. Illness in one family, resource shortage in another, structural damage in a third. But the community response followed similar patterns of mutual support, practical assistance, and balanced intervention designed to maintain function while addressing immediate need. This sophisticated approach to vulnerability challenged simplistic representations of Viking society as valorizing only strength and martial prowess. While Norse culture certainly celebrated particular forms of strength and expected significant self-reliance, their winter adaptations revealed a nuanced understanding that true resilience came not from individual invulnerability, but from community systems that effectively supported their most vulnerable members through crisis, while maintaining their dignity and role within the social fabric. As darkness deepened outside and the household prepared for another long winter night, Thorvald made a final check on his mother before seeking his own rest. Her breathing had eased further, suggesting the treatments were working as intended. Around her, the family continued its evening routine, sewing, carving, quiet conversation, maintaining normalcy despite the crisis while remaining alert to any change in her condition. This balance, crisis response integrated into ongoing function rather than disrupting it, characterized the Norse approach to winter vulnerability. By developing care systems that could be activated without compromising essential activities, they created sustainable responses to the inevitable challenges that winter brought to even the strongest communities. In this way, their treatment of the vulnerable became not a peripheral concern, but a central element of winter adaptation, as essential to survival as their material technologies, knowledge systems, and social structures. The strength of Norse winter communities lay not in the absence of vulnerability, but in their sophisticated responses to it, transforming potential weakness into manageable challenge through systems of care as carefully developed as any other aspect of their adaptation to northern life. The pounding at the door came just as darkness fell completely, barely audible above the howling wind that had intensified throughout the afternoon. Ragnar Sigurdsson, master of the modest farmstead, exchanged glances with his wife Helga before moving cautiously toward the sound. Winter visitors after nightfall were uncommon enough to warrant caution, particularly this far from established settlements. "Who comes to our door?" he called through the thick wooden planks, one hand on the iron hilt of his knife, a precaution born of experience rather than paranoia. "Travelers seeking shelter from the storm," came the reply, the voice nearly lost in a fresh gust of wind. "3 men from the western fjords caught by weather on our journey to Hedeby." Ragnar hesitated, weighing ancient obligations of hospitality against equally ancient concerns for his household safety. The Norse code regarding winter travelers created complex ethical territory, balancing humanitarian responsibility toward those caught in potentially lethal conditions against the very real risks that strangers might present to isolated households with limited winter resources. "I will open," he finally decided, "but be warned that this household stands ready to defend itself if your intentions prove false." This cautious welcome illustrated the fundamental Norse approach to winter travelers and outsiders, a pragmatic blend of essential hospitality with clear boundaries and protective measures. Unlike summer, when open doors and generous sharing posed limited risk to host households, winter transformed hospitality into a higher-stakes exchange where miscalculation could threaten survival for either party. As Ragnar unbarred the door, 3 snow-covered figures stumbled into the longhouse, bringing with them a blast of frigid air that momentarily dimmed the hearth fire. The household members, 13 in total, from Ragnar's elderly mother to his youngest grandchild, observed the newcomers with cautious interest as they shed ice-encrusted outer garments near the entrance. "We thank you for your shelter," said the apparent leader of the group, a broad-shouldered man of middle years who introduced himself as Thor Haraldsson. "The storm came upon us more quickly than expected, and night found us far from our intended stopping point." While Helga directed the preparation of hot drinks for the chilled travelers, Ragnar assessed them with experienced eyes. Their clothing and equipment marked them as men of some means. Their weapons were of good quality, but showed the wear of regular use, rather than mere display. And their manner suggested men accustomed to both giving and following orders. Traders, or perhaps minor nobles rather than simple farmers or laborers. This rapid evaluation represented another aspect of Norse approaches to winter outsiders: the necessity of quickly categorizing strangers according to their potential benefits and threats. In a season where resources were carefully calculated and social dynamics within confined spaces could rapidly deteriorate, accurate assessment of outside elements became crucial to household security. "What brings you to travel in winter?" Ragnar inquired as the men warmed themselves by the fire. The question was not merely conversational. Winter journeys were sufficiently dangerous that they were typically undertaken only for significant purpose rather than casual visitation. "We carry messages and trade agreements from Jarl Eriksson to his allies in Hedeby," Thor explained. "Matters that cannot wait until spring thaw if ships are to sail with the first open water." This explanation, indicating both legitimate purpose and potential value as information sources, shifted the dynamic subtly. The travelers were not merely anonymous strangers requiring humanitarian aid, but potentially useful connections to the wider world, from which Ragnar's household had been largely isolated since the first heavy snow weeks earlier. "You will share our evening meal," Ragnar declared, the formula indicating acceptance of the travelers as legitimate guests rather than merely stranded strangers. "And tell us news of the western settlements, for we have had few visitors since winter's grip tightened."